Welcome to the Perennial Media Podcast with Mukunda.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Perennial Media Podcast. This is your host Mukunda Raghavan. Namaste, Namaskar, Vanakkam, and Swagatam. And Khudafis also if you're a Muslim, and welcome to the show. Today we have interesting podcast. It's a unique one. We haven't done one of these before, and we're having a friend of mine who actually met a couple of years ago on another podcast. I think Abdullah Samir's podcast. It was 2 years ago, about the issue about depictions of Kali and so on and so forth in the secular jihadist world. So today we have Farhan Qureshi on, who is a former ex-Muslim, and I don't know if he wants to go by that terminology. He's now, I would say, perennialist. Except that wording, and a seeker for truth and knowledge, and just all around great guy. Farhan, how are you, man?
I'm doing well. Namaskar, pranam to you as well. We wouldn't say khadafis to greet though. That's usually when you
leave
when you're leaving.
Yeah.
But assalamu alaikum is usually how it works.
Yeah.
I mean, with regards to metaphysics, I obviously align myself with Hindu metaphysics, Vedantic types of metaphysics in terms of how I perceive the world. We'll get into that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is, in terms of my broader conversation with people, but especially Muslims, I think perennialism is an important, if not label, topic to bring up to acknowledge that I'm not a supremacist of any kind, nor do I think that you need to convert to what I believe, but rather this wisdom is actually perennial and it exists within your tradition, or the Islamic tradition, should I say. Ex-Muslim, I think that my belief, when it comes to my beliefs about the nature of reality and so on and so forth, purpose of life, what we're doing here, I think it aligns more with Hindu metaphysics, right? I wouldn't hesitate on it's so therefore I would say that the beliefs that I have, for example, that atheism is okay, right? That you don't have to pray 5 times a day in Arabic. Right, those types of beliefs, among other beliefs, are too heretical for me to fall within the realm of Islam, right? Within the da'ira or understanding of what traditional classical Islam is. So I had to admit to myself that I'm an ex-Muslim, and with regards to that. Now, with regards to perennialism and the spiritual wisdom that's there in the various traditions that are there in Islam, I have nothing but love and respect and admiration for that diversity of perspective, for the perennial perspective where it exists in the traditions of Islam, and as well as the love for the Muslim community. Usually when people are ex-Muslims, the idea is that this person is probably bigoted towards Muslims, or it's like contributing to Islamophobia.
Right.
And I would say that's far from true as far as I'm concerned. I would counter Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, which is kind of what I want to get in a little bit into that as well. Both the reasons why people might have a fear of Islam and Muslims, but also why it's unjustified given the diversity of Islam. I think that would be something interesting to discuss. But also, Mukunda, I want to spend the bulk of this conversation reacting to, along with you, if we may, without necessarily the footage, but reacting to some of the topics that came up in your podcast with the Dawahwise channel.
Sure.
If we can do that.
I think we could touch upon all those, right? I mean, one of the things that sits with me a lot is one of the reasons I started, this podcast or whatnot was primarily because, there was concerns, I thought, within, first of all, larger Hindu community, the Hindu community, about knowledge of like the traditions. Just one second, sorry. Yeah, so I apologize for that, everyone. I had a quick momentary issue, but the reason I started the channel was for multiple reasons. I'd say one reason was to inform a lot of the Hindu public and the Indian public about the nature of like their own traditions, their own their ideas and theories and just philosophies, and because I don't think many people knew about this stuff, right? At the end of the day, they were very much like they're ignorant, right? And that's not because it's like a willful ignorance. It's just there's a lot to grasp, and the nuance and the intricacies within the traditions were not explained well by our parents' generations. And I think we're seeing this new surge of that happening, which is great. And I wanted to be part of that. And secondly, I think it was also because I was kind of getting tired of seeing. I mean, I live in America, in the West, seeing a lot of depictions of Christianity, Islam discussed in a meaningful way, but nothing was ever really talked about in the Hindu tradition or Buddhist tradition or Jain tradition. And Buddhist tradition, when it is talked about, is like shorn of its metaphysical, theological like underpinnings, right? People in the West love to think of Buddhism as this like vipassana only or mindfulness and this secular kind of Buddhism, but Buddhism isn't that, right? It is a complex, deeply metaphysical, theological tradition, even though it doesn't have an ultimate God in the same way that many traditions do, but it has very similar ideas and has very similar like concepts. And so the podcast was to do that. And then as we did more of this, I wanted to do more interfaith stuff, not because like I want to fight and argue. It's really to get a sense of what other traditions are saying. And I've studied some of these traditions, and I want other people to know that no tradition or religion is a monolith unto itself. There's variety of viewpoints and ideas and theories. Yeah, there's certain things you can disagree with vehemently within other traditions, but ultimately there's truths that we're all striving for, and to recognize that and to see that we're all on this journey together, and one might be more right than the other and whatever, but it's not a zero-sum game. And we don't have to treat anyone as an enemy. And that's where I was trying to get. The more we familiarize ourselves with each other, the less we treat someone like an other or an enemy. So that's kind of what I was trying to get to. So
that's exactly my spirit as well. I want to bring people together. I want there to be less animosity, less fear of one another, better understanding of one another. I think that it's the best world, that the best conversations could create the best world in that way. I definitely agree. For me personally, maybe it's not for you. I'm all game for a debate where it's worldview versus worldview in terms of what's the better approximation or correspondence to the nature of reality, without it being a competition, right? And two people in a very Ghazali way trying to find the camel, regardless of who finds it. We're grateful that it was found. So in that sense, I agree with you with debate. It's not, for me anyways, it's not about defeating the other person in argument, proving myself right, or my perspective right and theirs wrong, but rather to have a refinement of perspective, an understanding of perspective. So that spirit that you have, I mean, is the same spirit that I come to the conversations that I have. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you. And not only that, but you are, to a degree, if I may use the word, pro-Islam and pro-Muslims, in the sense that you're like me, you're hoping for the best versions of Islam to come forward, and you know what I mean. You're hoping for the best interpretations that allow people to assimilate, live and let live, and so on and so forth. I think one issue that you're going to deal with, and especially coming onto the Dawahwise channel, is that there are Christians, just like there's Christians who are Bible thumpers and supremacists with regards to their worldview. There are also Muslims who are Quran thumpers and supremacists in terms of their worldview, and supremacists to the effect that not only is their worldview the correct one, and yours is wrong categorically, and right, it is also a path. Your path is also a path to hellfire as a result of having the incorrect theology, and shirk and so on and so forth. And when you're dealing with Quran thumpers or the Dawah people, the Dawah crowd, you might be dealing with that rather than dealing with people who might be interested in mutual understanding. The classic example would be Jordan Peterson's conversations with Mohammed Hijab. I don't know if you saw those.
Yeah, I saw that.
But they were it was evident that they were trying to convert them the whole time. The gentleman that Peterson was with, Jonathan Pagyu, he not only acknowledged it during the debate, but had this whole subsequent commentary on how distasteful that evangelical Quran thumping perspective really is, rather than merely a coming to common terms and appreciating one another, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so it's clearly that they were interested in converting, and will you convert to, and that's the nature of these Dawah people and these Quran thumpers. You know what I mean? But that's not everybody. I think that there are plenty of other types of Muslims, which we're going to talk about today, that don't fall in that category, and that is something to be appreciated, I think.
Right, and I'll put it this way: like, I mean, I do love a debate. My internet persona is very different from my real life persona. I think like many people get emboldened on the internet, and they're like on Twitter they're really mean, but in person they're really nice and sweet. I think I'm probably a little more the opposite. I'm really nice and sweet online, and then in person I'm a little more confrontational. But that being said, I do think there's something. So I enjoyed, this is the second time I've been on Dawahwise. So I kind of was the first time I came on was really impromptu, and spent a little bit of time talking to them, and it was a couple hours, and that was great. And even this time I enjoyed it. Ultimately, like, I think they, they're doing what they believe is true, and not to say it's right. I don't think necessarily the constant need to Dawah is the way to engage, but I understand that perspective, and I want to understand why they believe what they believe.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing in that sense for me, like, so within the Indian intellectual tradition, right, we have what's known as preferable. Where we have to, before we, if you read any commentary by Shankara Madhava or any text that wants to present their perspective, what they end up doing is they first steelman in many ways the perspective of their opponents, right? Their objections, their viewpoints, they'll do that, and then they'll respond to their opponent, and then they'll have their opponent respond back, and then they'll finally present the ultimate view that they hold to be the siddhanta or the path, right? Sure. So you have to, which is why, for example, in traditional when they talk about Ramanuja's commentary and Shankara's, or Ramanuja's commentary on the Brahma Sutras compared to Shankara's, Ramanuja does, every single scholar of Advaita will tell you that his presentation of Advaita was as best as you can from an Advaitic perspective. He presents it in a manner that the tradition itself fully would be able to defend. But he also responds to it in his own way. So the idea at the end of the day is for me to know what I don't want to even say opponent, my interlocutor. I need to know what my interlocutor's position is, so that I am able to think it through and come to a place where I can fully, competently defend their argument from their perspective.
Steelman it essentially. Yeah.
And the only way I could do that is to understand what their views are, right? So, and this is a conversation, and we'll find, I think we're finding some common ground. And I do, I think most of the team at Dawahwise so far has been pretty congenial and on the same page.
Absolutely.
So I do appreciate
I know some of those. I know of some of those gentlemen, Abdurrahman and Sharif Abu Layth are from the Thought Adventure podcast. So I've seen their show a couple of times. I've had brief engagement with them, with the two of them, very brief, I would say. Nothing but cordial individuals, respectful, professional, no type of condescension or anything. So I appreciated them. And I felt that Muhammad, who I've never met before, thought of or heard of before prior to seeing your podcast with them, I thought that he was absolutely respectful, cordial.
He's great.
Well, and the three of them are philosophically, oriented. So they have a grasp. In matter of fact, they were the go-to when it came to philosophy and philosophical literature and thinkers. Those three individuals are clearly in your conversation the go-to individuals. The other two individuals, Mansoor, I've seen on the speaker's corner. I've probably seen a few clips of him, and the other gentleman, Hisham, I believe.
Hashim, yeah.
Is it Hashim or Hisham? I think it's
Hashim, but yeah.
I'll go with Hisham because that's what I remember. If I'm wrong, my bad.
Okay.
Those two guys seem more like a Zakir Naik type of apologist, right?
Yeah, I've watched Mansoor a few times on Speaker's Corner. I think, from my understanding, he's supposed to be kind of a Quranic expert. Like he knows the Quran really well. Hashim, I've seen a few times too, but I think he's a generalist, like many of these people. Yeah.
No, I got Zakir Naik vibes from both of them in terms of the way that they approach apologetics, right? philosophically inept, depending on,
So when you were doing apologetics, like how did you approach it?
Within the context of Islam?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was definitely interested in the rational and mystical approaches to the tradition, right? That was something that interested me. This was again over 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so no, philosophy, mysticism, and theology were definitely, that is to say, scripture, Quran and Sunnah in a Sunni context back then when I was involved in apologetics. Was important to me. Now, granted, when I wasn't, how did I get involved in apologetics? Initially, my my introduction to the Dawah world was talking about the issue of Khatamun Nubuwah, where Muhammad is the last and final messenger, and no prophet is to appear after him, as it pertains to the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam that believes that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was a prophet, right? So that's kind of where my focus was, like what Khatam an-Nubuwah, la Nabi Abadi.
Were you Ahmadiyya?
That's how I was born and raised in the United States to an Ahmadi family. At the age of 17, I made the decision that I don't think that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was the second coming of Jesus, right? And that's and so I went it. So I became a Sunni Muslim essentially, and so. That's I'm in my mid to late 30s now, and so that was a very long time ago.
Oh yeah.
Right. I think I said I apostated from Islam when I was 27, and so that was almost 10 years ago, and so time flies, man.
Did you? Can I just ask? Did you have, when you apostated? Did you have a lot of issues with your community, your friends? Was that a
initially?
Problem?
Initially, but now, bro. I'm, I would also use the word pro-Islam and Muslims. I love Islam as a tradition, a rich tradition.
Sure.
And I love the Muslim community. I do not, under any circumstances, believe in the meta-narrative that, God sends prophets and books and scriptures and divine command theory and whatnot. That's not, that does not correspond to the nature of reality as far as I'm concerned, comparatively to what we're going to discuss, hopefully, as we get into your conversation with Dawahwise. We'll see how that plays out a little bit.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's an unconvincing meta narrative to me, right? This perspective that there's a judgmental deity outside of you, divine command theory sends prophets and scriptures to a particular lineage, bloodline lineage through Abraham. That whole meta narrative, I don't have any reason to believe that that's true. I do think that human beings of the past, attempted at spirituality, mysticism, philosophy, and so on and so forth. And so I do look at these as, personally, I look at these as human attempts at God and spirituality and so on and so forth. And so I in spite of that, even though that they are human attempts, they are still, everything is from God. There's nothing that's not from God. From my perspective, and that Islam has had the impact that it's had on the world that it's meant to have in terms of the necessary divine will, if you will. And so there's a lot of good and there's a lot of great and that comes from Islam. There's controversial that comes with Islam, and it's all meant to be exactly what it is.
Right. I think generally broadly align with that, right? Because I feel like if you are fundamentally a person that adheres to karma as a mechanism of engagement of the world, then it's just cause and effect, right? So inevitably this would have been the case because it could have been nothing else, right? It just, and that goes for this is where I mean, we can get into this later, is my conversations with a lot of people are free will, or my ideas on free will are very flux, right? I'm almost like a determinist in some sense, but I do believe we have mental free will, meaning like we have the ability to will ourselves mentally to whatever we want, but the actuality is deterministic.
Yeah.
So
I would entertain such compatibilism, right? I would. I'm more along the determinist, coming from a social science perspective rather than a philosophical perspective. And most of my experience is in social science and counseling, right? I'm not a philosopher by training by any means, although I've delved or dabbled into philosophy. I probably wouldn't get into the intricacies of Leibniz or Spinoza the way that some philosophers would, right? But I'm aware. But like I said, most of my training is in social science, and so my interest is the human condition. Right. And the reason why I got into psychology was to better understand the human condition as it pertained to brainwashing, indoctrination, if you will, with regards to religion and political ideology and how that takes hold of minds, right? That's kind of what I was initially interested in, primarily going through an identity crisis growing up in the United States as a Pakistani Muslim in the midst of liberal America and conservative America for that matter, in trying to find myself. So to better understand myself and the human condition, my family, the Muslim community, I was interested in psychology rather than philosophy, and it was helpful. It was helpful, and it has been helpful in terms of knowledge and perspective. And we'll get in. I do.
But I'll put it. It's very interesting because I think like within the Hindu tradition, right, the psychology is part of the philosophy, right?
No doubt.
It's a phenomenological kind of engagement, right? Like even the entire, if you look at a large part of the Gita, it's all about how the mind works, right?
Yeah.
How the
mind. The Dharma is psychology. Is like some of the original.
So I find it very interesting. Like just the even Yoga Sutras, how they talk about the nature of concentration and our attention and the raga, dvesha,
the buddhi and dhyana,
and just how these things pull for, like you have these aversions and you have your compunctions and you're pulled in these directions and dispositions of past life and so on, build towards one versus other, and it's like this really interesting dynamic.
So that's the difference, that when somebody asks me about the difference between Dharma and the Abrahamic traditions, that's kind of what I, whether it's Sikhi tradition, Jain, Buddhist, or the Hindu Sampradaya, the Vedantic the Vedic Sampradayas, that they all, for me anyways, are a path of self-awareness, right? A path of self-awareness that leads to self-knowledge and self-mastery, right? And of course, what we mean by the self, you got into it with Dawahwise. It's not the ahamkar, it's not the nafs, it's not the ego, right? But and that's the thing is, I think with some Islamic terminology in comparison, that conversation really could have gone a little bit differently. But you did an outstanding job, don't get me wrong. But I wanted, when we get into that conversation, I want to bring in some of these things, right? But anyways, going back to this notion of Dharma being a path of self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-mastery. The Abrahamic traditions are about divine command theory and judgment, to a deity.
It is. I will. So the other thing is, like, we have to be also very, very honest and critical about this. Is we have a whole corpus of texts like Dharma Shastras are very much focused on things like how to live in the world, what to do, what not to do, depending on your varna, your jati, or your social position, your gender. So these texts are very controlled for how they see society should be by certain thinkers, right? Like whether it's Manu, Yajnavalkya, whatever. But I think the big difference from what my reading of these texts and of reading even the Quran or the Bible is, even though these texts are from or said to be from these divine or semi-divine beings, there's entire texts are about like, well, this is wrong, but if you do it, then there's 85 different penances you can choose from, right? It's really this way of like for example, like one of the things that I think Manu talks about is like infidelity and homosexuality are both considered like a sinful act. But the act itself can be expiated by taking a shower. So it's saying like because the whole idea within these traditions are like every action we take has karmic consequences, right? Even breathing in fundamentally is killing creatures and causing himsa, right? And there's karmic consequences for that. So everything from these texts about like, well, some things are more better to do within a certain context, and other things are worse to do, and so on and so forth. So there's means for us to try to mitigate the karmic consequences. And also Dharma is also about the maintenance of society, right? What is a society today? How are we going to sustain it, maintain it, hold it up? And sometimes there are moral conundrums, right? Like the Mahabharata talks about them all the time, whether it's going to be like do I kill this person? Do I lie to kill this person so that we can win this war and Dharma and justice can be served? Or do I not lie about this? Right. So, and even God in this sense, like Krishna, tells people you have to be sometimes you have to apply virtue ethics. Sometimes you have to be utilitarian. Sometimes you have to be deontological, and it's all contextual.
Yeah, no, everything. I definitely agree that every action is contextual, even though it has its consequences, no doubt. So what I want to kind of delve into before we get into the Dawahwise channel is to speak to the diversity within the tradition of Islam. I know that you spoke to it in your channel, in your conversation with Dawahwise, but if we could get, just to, and here's why this is important, right? Is because particularly in Bharat and Indian culture, for people who are not familiar with the diversity of Islam, right? That they just kind of look at Islam as maybe as a monolith, that when there's a hadith about Ghazwa-e-Hind, that it necessitates that Muslims in general have this belief in their mind and in their hearts that India is to be taken over by Islam, right? Or other such issues. I think another, that anything outside of the occupation of Islam is Darul Harb, versus that which is occupied by Islamic law and people and individuals is Darul Islam. That while this is perhaps the thinking of some Muslims, right, that the majority of Muslims do not have a political or ideological bend to their spirituality or their religious life, that there are nominal Muslims, that there are cultural Muslims, there are liberal Muslims, there are people who are ex-Muslims, meaning that they come from a Muslim background, whether they profess to be or not. By virtue of what they believe, they are no longer Muslim. And then there's liberal Muslims, and then there's various philosophical and rational Muslims, and then there's Muslims who are on the path of mysticism. Hang on one second. Give me 1 second. That's the thing about doing this thing. Stripes of Muslims, yeah.
So go ahead.
All right, sorry about that. So yeah, we were talking about the different stripes of Muslims, and I think that there's moderate Muslims. You don't have to be a quote unquote liberal Muslim. And I'm not a liberal. I take postmodern and liberal stances and postures on some things, and I can take traditional and conservative postures on other stances. I'm very much an independent thinker that takes it issue by issue, right? And I think that there's a lot of problems with liberalism. So, and there's nuance with regards to thinkers in the tradition of Islam as well,
right?
And we have to grant that when we're dealing with the religion and dealing with adherents of the religion, and this helps deal with so Islamophobia is thinking that Islam is inherently a terroristic type of religion that wants to oppress and so on and so forth. Now, granted, there are versions of Islam and interpretations of Islam that are like that, right? You hear some of their preaching, you hear things like Ghazwa-e-Hind, you look into the history, you see some of the actions of the Muslims, you look in our contemporary world, and there's terrorist attacks. So anybody who hasn't grown up in the Muslim community and hasn't grown up learning Islam, when you look at that, how can you not expect Islamophobia, right? And so it's particularly the Wahhabi and Salafi teachings, although you can get the Deobandi and strands of Islam that have, not necessarily terroristic types of violent types of thinking, not necessarily that, but extremely literalist, dogmatic, judgmental, fascist-like ideology emerges amongst these literalist conservative types, Salafis, Atharis. The Athari, these Athari Muslims, that they're Muhammad Hijab and Yasir Qadi, this new neo-Athari wave of Muslim thinkers are basically individuals who come from that lineage of Salafism. The Medina University is a seminary in Saudi Arabia that dispenses this Wahhabi, Salafi, sometimes Madkhali, meaning nationalistic with regards to Saudi Arabia, and as well as now this neo-Athari phenomenon, right? Where they want to skip Bin Baz, Al-Albani, Ibn Uthaymeen, Sheikh Fawzan, and that whole Medina University authority, and surpass it and go to Ibn Taymiyyah, justify using philosophy in a very, sometimes even in an Ibn Sina way, which is heretical according to these mainstream Salafis. Indulgence in ilm al-kalam and philosophy is a dangerous thing to do, right? It's discouraged, and some people would even say that you shouldn't do it because it's going to bring shubahat, doubts, and possibly even apostasy. And so, so what I'm saying is that this neo-Athari movement is trying to preserve the tawheed of the Salafis, so there's no shirk and grave worshipping and bid'ah and all this stuff. They're trying to maintain all of that while now indulging in philosophy, which is contrary to their lineage. The Hanabila, the Salafiyya, the Wahhabiyya, the Athari, those that would claim to be Athari, it's almost like a new movement in Islam, right? It's interesting to see these Dawah people in terms of how they're operating and how they're doing their Dawah now. And so there is this diversity, and there are versions of Islam that obviously cause Islamophobia, concern to people, but that's not how all Muslims think. As a matter of fact, I would say that the Muslim that I've come across anecdotally, I've never met anybody who is politically or ideologically motivated, or us versus them mentality, or those are kuffar and we are believers. That usually, I mean, at least the Muslims that I was around didn't necessarily think that way. And I think that's also important.
Yeah, I mean, in my life personally, I've never met Muslims that think that way, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's Pakistani or Indian or Bangladeshi or even from the Middle East or whatnot, I've never met people like that. So it is interesting for me to see and hear about it online.
It exists.
Yeah, it exists. I mean, I assume it does. Yeah, it has to.
No, it definitely does. I mean, you could ask some of these other schools of thought, like the Ismaili community, for example, or the Ahmadiyya community, or some of the Sufi tariqas, or how they are takfired against and how they are treated by the mainstream Muslims. The same terroristic types of things that non-Muslims fear are often applied
to
some of the minority. To some of the minority communities, or it's at the very least takfir that these people are not Muslim, they're outside of the fold of Islam, and historically we know that takfir can usually be a death sentence under the Sharia law, and so those the Islamophobia and some of the concerns that emerge result from the behaviors of some of these people who actually believe the things that people would be concerned with regards to their beliefs, right? So it exists, but I don't think that is representative. I think it's like, again, Islam is diverse. There are Muslims that I've known, Mukunda, who I would say that we would be able to say to each other that we are brethren in Islam, in spite of all of my heresies, in spite of all of my beliefs. We could say Assalamu alaikum, and we would actually see each other as brethren in Islam. Now, granted, Mukunda, from my perspective, from my worldview, if we were to do that, you would be a Muslim, right? Anybody who is surrendering to the will of God, as far as I'm concerned. And when you metaphorize and spiritualize everything in the Quran and Sunnah, you could arrive at, that Islam is a general principle of where nature submits to the will of God. The prophets and gurus and shamans that appeared, they were surrendering to what is, and so on and so forth, and they're following that divine principle. So in that light, obviously I could embrace these people as brethren in Islam, and we wouldn't look at each other as kuffar, right? Well, obviously I wouldn't, but they wouldn't look at me as kuffar. And it's fascinating that is even possible, that I would even experience that, given the level of heresy and unorthodoxy that I present with regards to metaphysics.
Right.
So it is interesting.
No, I think it's fascinating. I think it's 1,400 years of history in different parts of the world and different traditions that have, continued on. So yeah, it's got to be very diverse, and you're going to have the full spectrum here. But I think there are things, that people are should know about. And I think fundamentally that's one of the purposes of having a conversation is what are your beliefs? Like if you're a Salafi, and what are your Salafi beliefs? And then if we get into Ismaili, well, Ismaili beliefs, what are those? You know, to get that sense of like how different things are, you know, like, or even like someone like, you know, I think Dr. Javed Hashmi is Hashim he doesn't accept Sunnah, right? He doesn't accept any of this of the what's it called, the
Hadith.
Hadith.
I think that there's a little bit of a difference between what we would call a Quran only Muslim that then rejects the authority of Hadith versus somebody who rejects the authority of the Sunnah, should I say. And so where he's a Quran, what we could call a Quran centrist Muslim, where we'll look at the mutawatir hadith and accept them, or we might look at the hadith and see if they contradict the Quran or the spirit of the text, and then reject those hadith. Right. And so the science of hadith that the Sunnis have, they might not, the ilm al-rajal and the sanad and the matan, the chain of the narrations, and the matan meaning the meaning of the hadith, whether the meaning of the hadith, the matan, if it seemingly contradicts the Quran, we would just reject those hadith. So I don't see Javad Hashmi as a hadith reject. I don't want to speak for him. I definitely don't.
This is just from what I've seen of him and like his posts on Twitter. So
yeah. But of what I've seen, same, I don't think that he would reject. I'm not sure. I don't think he rejects the authority of the Sunnah and the Hadith. If he does, he does. But I don't think that he does. I think that he would be a Quran centrist Muslim.
Well, I should have him on the podcast. He can maybe explain that.
No, I think, I'm a big fan of Javad Hashmi, and you mentioned the Ismailis, Dr. Khalil Andani, who's also fantastic. Like, those are two individuals that when they present Islam, it's almost identical to what we believe. Nearly identical. Like metaphysics, focus on orthopraxy rather than theology, and so on and so forth. So there's so much. The Ismaili tradition is as advanced of metaphysics as you can get.
Right? Here, let me ask you this question, man. It's just a thought that hit my head. You know, past few times is there seems to be a lot of the apologetics and the stuff we're seeing online seems to be mostly centered around Bangladeshi or Pakistani Muslims, right? I don't see much of that kind of work being done by people from whether the Middle East or Southeast Asia or I
don't know. Here's the thing. I think the Saudi Arabia petrodollars really went into propagating Islam, especially in the 90s. They had what's called the Salafi publications, and they had people backing them like Yusuf Estes and Bilal Phillips and Zakir Naik, you know what I mean? And so I do think I think that there's plenty of activists from the Middle East. You know, Mohammed Hijab, Ali Dawah, you know.
That's true. Those guys,
they are probably some of the main ones, you know what I mean? Then there's converts to Islam like Hamza Sortsis, who kind of began this probably one of the individuals that began the contemporary Dawah world that we see. So okay, just a quick, I'm going to break this down like quick few seconds, right? So from what I gather, the Salaf, the first three generation of Muslims, they did not have these Greek philosophical arguments that eventually Ibn Sina and others would bring up, right? So you know, their Dawah was primarily the Quran and the Sunnah, just like the Salafis, right? So this begins to develop a few generations later, you know, with the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, well, not a few generations, I guess, within the context of the Salaf, right? So probably around the third generation, second generation, the indulgence of Greek philosophy by the Qadariyya, the Jabariyya, the Jahmiyyah, who they referred to, eventually the Mu'tazila, and then the philosopher, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi,
Ghazali,
Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd.
Razi,
I don't, well, you know, Ghazali was he wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, so he was arguing against Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, right? But Ibn Taymiyyah also indulged in a little bit of philosophy to refute the philosophers, right? So, but that indulgence, you know, comes a little bit later. in terms of the Islamic traditions. It's not directly from the Prophet and his companions, from what I can gather. And so then, the influence of the philosopher, I haven't seen too many Muslims, other than somebody like Dr. Khalil Andani, or some thinkers, maybe Hashmi's influenced by them. The Shia who follow Mullah Sadra are also mystics, who are also on the perennial line of thinking. They often cite the philosopher as well. Obviously, mysticism and irfan from a Shia perspective is a little bit of a different, just like mysticism and rationalism are different in most traditions, there are different fields in the Islamic tradition as well. And so when you get somebody like an Ibn Arabi who says wahdatul wujud, the unity of being, when you get somebody like Mullah Sadra, who comes from the Shia lineage, you really get into the ballpark of what I would call the perennial philosophy. So the perennial philosophy simply states that mystics from all traditions, all cultures have had the unitive oneness, Advaita experience, right?
Yeah.
And it's from and that's all that the perennial philosophy says, that this unitive oneness experience is universal across the board.
Which it has to be, right? At the end of the day, right? Yeah. I mean, like for if God exists for everybody, and God can be accessed by everybody. And
the Muslims call it the fitra, which I completely love that term. I do believe that it's innate, this knowledge of God, so much so that with the psychedelics, when you look at the science, you consume, say you take psilocybin mushrooms. The point is that the brain is already designed, if you want to go the intelligent design route.
Right.
The brain is already, it doesn't need those mushrooms, right? For you to consume that psychedelic substance. The brain is designed to have this experience, first person subjective phenomenological experience.
I mean, just on that note, I mean, what I tend to agree. So I take the position, I think, of like, certain Kundalini practices, the idea of bandhas, right? There's blockages, right? So I think inherently, to engage in the world as we do now, we have to have blockages in our brain, and that you get over by meditation or psychedelics, right? I think psychedelics, they unblock those blocks put in, right? Our brains are built this way for us to engage in the world so that we can get the things we need to do to survive, right? If we're constantly in this state of divinity all the time, we're experiencing the world,
be able to function,
nothing will function, right?
Nothing will get done, society wouldn't function.
I think this is where like the brain has actually been designed to do the opposite of what we want out of our break free of samsara, so to speak, right?
No doubt.
I think it's very,
but it still has that potential, right? of the mystical experience, right? And so it's designed that way, in psilocybin or some psychedelic is simply triggering what's already there. And so, the argument that this is chemicals in the brain is a weak argument. It's a debunked argument. If anybody ever gives that argument that psychedelics are just a chemical, it's the weakest argument that you could give. Every phenomenological experience involves brain anatomy, chemistry, and function. It just doesn't follow that, it's a chemical, so therefore the phenomenological experience has no truth value. But that's a different, psychedelics is a different conversation. Right. So I know we kind of jumped a little bit to a couple of different places.
No, that's fine.
I think we got to speak to the diversity of Islam. I got to say that, look, I love Islam as a tradition, and I love the Muslim community, that I'm not interested in being Muslim, that my metaphysics are primarily Hindu metaphysics because of my experience with psychedelics. So that's a good way of kind of introducing where I'm coming from. And I think that we can get into, unless there's any other follow-up or thoughts or questions about where we are. I do want to say, I think a lot of people have been asking, where why aren't I creating videos, all that kind of stuff. Dude, I'm not a YouTuber. I don't have time. I love listening to a lot of podcasts and stuff like that, but it's not just something I'm interested in engaging. Nabil Qureshi, I don't know if you're familiar with him. So when he died, and then I've had other funerals as well, it just kind of took me out of the whole public conversation, and for purposes of self-reflection and thought about it all, and some of the things that have come out of it is a deeper appreciation for that universal reconciliation. And by universal reconciliation is that whatever the process, reincarnation, purgatory, or what have you, that all is reconciled into the divine reality. I genuinely believe that. And growing up as a Muslim, I was not taught that. I mean, well, the way that the Sunni Muslim theologians explain it, that's not what I was taught to believe, but rather there's hellfire to pay for theology, for aqidah, right? For because you didn't have the appropriate understanding of God, whether God is above a throne or is a trinity or is everywhere or nowhere. Like to say that these are things that actually matter in terms of divine judgment is, for lack of better terms, an absurdity as far as I'm concerned. And that's the thing about debating. I don't want to debate Muslims that I have no issues with, no quarrels with. If you're a Muslim that's a universalist, a pluralist, a perennialist, you have rationality and mysticism as a part of your path, I have no quarrels with you. You're brethren in humanity and in spirit, and maybe if you can view it that way in Islam. No issues with you. It's people like Muhammad Hijab, the Quran thumpers, the exclusivists. You guys are wrong. Your beliefs are despised by God. You guys are idol worshippers and mushrikeen and kuffar because of your beliefs, right? Because of your theology. That is what I would like to challenge, and I would challenge it based on social science, based on psychology, sociology, the human condition, philosophy, rationality, and I think that I would obliterate their perspective. To be honest with you, if I ever faced a Muhammad Hijab, I think I would obliterate his perspective.
Now, I would love to see that one day.
Yeah, we could take some postmodern postures, deconstruct his ideology, show how the meta narrative of a judgmental deity that is outside of you through divine command theory, who is sending prophets to a particular bloodline lineage in the Middle East, is not the meta narrative of the world. That there's an alternative meta narrative that we can explore, and hopefully, Mukunda, you and I explore it as we get through this Dawahwise. Now we get through this Dawahwise.
I'm going on part 2 on their show in probably like 2-3 weeks. So it'll be interesting.
Yep. Which part? Oh, the Dawahwise people. Okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully your association with we will not keep them from doing that.
I mean, it shouldn't, right?
Yeah, I don't mind engaging them. Like, you know what I mean? I think, Abdul Rahman is wonderful. I don't have an interest in debating him. I think he's a very decent, good individual. I have no quarrels with him.
Right.
Sharif Abu-Laid seems like a decent individual. I don't know that he can step into the milieu of social science and deal with the arguments. I don't want to debate Sharif. He seems like a nice guy. Muhammad Hijab, and it's somebody like him, I can't even think of anybody else. I would love to debate them, put worldview against worldview. Let's see what is kindergarten theology versus advanced theology, and see which one it has more of an approximation and correspondence to the reality that we share, the objective reality that we share, as well as an intersubjective conversation about the nature of God, which is also something that we can have.
I will say that I've been following Hamza Zorsi's over a few years. I feel there's been a change in him in his ways approaching. So like he's not
Hamza Zorsi's, he seems like a nice guy.
Yeah.
He's kind of, have you noticed that he's kind of backed out, right? So I was talking about Hamza Zorsi in terms of the history of the Dawah. So before Hamza Zorsi's, there was you had the beginning of the modern day Dawah with Sheikh Ahmed Didat, and then eventually the petrodollar funded Zakir Naik, and then you have somebody who you would say Javad Hashmi, you would say Khalil Andani, maybe you would say Mufti Abu Layth, in terms of forward thinkers in the tradition of Islam. I would absolutely put Dr. Shabir Ali in that category. Wonderful spirit, wonderful human being, really universalist.
I want to talk to Shabir Ali, actually. I would love to talk to him.
Wonderful human being, really good theological perspective.
And he seems honest. And that's the thing I really do enjoy. Like I see his videos online, and he seems like he grapples with things, honestly.
Yep. So apologetics, right? So Shabir Ali started having these debates with William Lane Craig.
Yeah.
William Lane Craig has this contingency argument. He's reviving the Kalam cosmological argument in debates against atheists. The Muslims are like, oh, look at this stuff.
Yeah.
And then they start mimicking, right? Going against the Athari Creed, Salafi Creed, if they follow that. I mean, if they're Ash'aira or Maturidi or Ismaili, I could see them taking maybe, you know, some of this route. But it's interesting to see these Wahhabis, these Salafis, these Atharis now joining, maybe not the Salafis and the Wahhabis, but the Atharis joining this philosophical Dawah,
right,
rather than the Zakir Naik type of Dawah that we're used to, right? But it happens because Hamza Sortis gets interested in these William Lane Craig arguments. He creates this team of which Muhammad Hijab is a part of, and eventually you get the Sapiens Institute. So that's the contemporary Dawah, and they're getting a clout with Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and they're kind of on a roll with regards to their Dawah. I think that it ought to be challenged in a respectful way. You know, my thing is, it's the debates are old. The Christian versus Muslim debate, the atheist versus Muslim debate. These debates are old. And I think that there needs to be a different kind of conversation and different kind of debate. Now, granted, Mukunda, when I approach a debate, I'm not a scholar of Hinduism, right? I don't know Sanskrit, and I'm not a scholar of Islam, and I haven't mastered classical Fusa Arabi either. What I can do is I can apply critical thinking skills. My background is in psychology and social science and counseling,
right,
and I can analyze the human condition and compare it to the theological perspective of the Muslims. That's my route. I can take some postmodern postures, deconstruct their ideology, and I can talk about the nature of reality and the best epistemology to reach truth.
Well,
right?
I think you've read so much of the philosophy and the Quran, and you know so much about
their perspective.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, but you know, I think that's a conversation I would love to see between you and any of the Dawah dudes.
Yeah, like I said, I'm interested in conversation with some of them. Muhammad Hijab mostly. You know what I mean? That's the one that I would be really interested in. But I don't think it's the time yet. I think that maybe eventually in the future, he won't be able to avoid except to deal with what I have to bring to the table. And that's fine. If that's what we need to create, then that's what we'll create. But this is a very different perspective. For those of you that might be listening on my channel or Mukunda's channel, spiritualxmuslim.com. Spiritualxmuslim.com. My whole perspective is outlined so you know what you're dealing with when you enter the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritualxmuslim.com.
I'll put it in the show notes.
So, yeah. And so you know, they can review it. You know what I mean? Hijab is the only one that I would really be interested in debating. You know, there's somebody like Daniel Hakikachu, but I don't know about that dude. You know, there seems to be like a dark cloud. There's the vibes are off, the energy is off for me, and so
I just saw his
Javad Hashmi said something. He even said it, you know, in his podcast against Mufti Abu Layth, and it is what it may. You know, I pray that God gives him healing and whatnot. But I'm not interested in debating Hakikachu. I don't know what it is. It's just doesn't interest me.
I just saw a debate with him and this guy Destiny about Andrew Tate, and it was
right. I haven't seen that yet.
It's
I am gonna.
It's a little comical.
Watch that. Yeah. Andrew Tate's gonna blow up in their face. He's gonna blow up in their face.
Maybe not. I mean, we'll see what the facts of that case lay out. But end of the day, you know, I mean, I'm not
even the fact of that case. But we're gonna see how. You know, I hope and I pray that he can ascertain Islam and you know, repent from his past. I do hope and pray that for him. But I'm skeptical whether he's capable.
But I do think there's the historical problem of people like Tate coming into a space, and that there's so many young men who find that kind of masculinity to be appealing, where I find it to be uncultured, brutish, and kind of very like
no doubt
toxic, right? There's
toxic. You could say toxic, and it's unfortunate because there's a place for masculinity and masculine men, femininity and feminine women, as much as there's space for the androgynous spectrum,
for trans, for gays, for anyone. Like, this world is amazingly diverse, beautiful place.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we all have to be able to live together and grow together and sustain each other. And the system that allows people to be who they are to the best of the system is so important. And at the end of the day, I just think like there is conversations that need to be had about what it means to be a man, especially I would say as within the Hindu context, we have to have a conversation because we have so many examples for textual, like someone like Rama, right? Let's just use him as an example, right? End of the day, one man, one wife, treats her as a goddess in so many ways. The story of the Ramayana is a story about how to be a man in many ways, but also how to wear man or woman, how to wear the agency of a king or a prince or a ruler. And it's a beautiful story, right? So
absolutely,
Mahabharata also has these conversations about how to be a good man, how to be a bad man, and how to how women can play the same role, good women, bad women, whatever.
The virtues that
right
are becoming of somebody who would say that they are trying to be a man that can provide and protect and so on and so forth. Absolutely. Right. But the Andrew Tate is known to be a scammer, and the type of scamming that he's done in the past is he admits it, and whether he's scamming the Muslims, time will tell.
But I think people like him primarily
in their face,
two
but
reasons.
I might be wrong.
The two reasons they really like him is he's physical, meaning he can fight. There's something really powerful to a lot of men about a powerful man, right?
Well, that hasn't improved. Yeah, I mean, his kickbox. I'm a fan of martial arts. I don't know. I don't think that he. I don't know if he's beaten anybody that's been. He hasn't done kickboxing in quite a while.
Yeah,
I think that if he stepped in there with Jake Paul, who's on our side, I'm team Jake Paul, who's about spirituality, meditation, right? The universe, manifestation, right? The Paul brothers are. But I think that just looking at them face off, I think Jake Paul would totally knock him out.
I mean, I'm not going to get into all that. I'm just for me, like I just like I'm just saying the appeal of him is that he's this physical masculine dude.
Sure.
And then he's got like this pompous status, quote unquote, right?
Yeah.
Which is
same thing with Muhammad Hijab. Pompous, narcissistic, bullying others. Now, granted, I'm with Muhammad Hijab, there's a part of me that is entertained by him, right? He's very intellectual and smart. I think he's good for the Muslims, right? In the sense that Muslims need, they need somebody who's going to be, to protect the community and to stand up for the community. The alpha male. It's good for them to have that personality. I just don't agree with this. I think his theology is off. His worldview is off. And I think that his worldview can easily be refuted. And when you really articulate what the meta narrative that he has, it's a very kindergarten theology perspective. It's what you would expect God to be teaching a child, right? And to divine command theory, from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know fully his theology, but the things I've seen, it's very simplistic.
Very simplistic, right?
And the people are very. I think that's the certainty that people want, though. People want something simple and digestible, right?
But what is the truth? With regards to what is the truth, right? With the capital T, I know that you would see it differently because there is duality and then there's not non-duality as well. I even can talk to God in a dualistic sense, and I can perceive God in a monist sense. I think that's not contradictory, right? But I mean, to think that God, that there's a judgmental deity outside of you who is sending prophets to them, it's when you compare it to an evolutionary model that mankind is evolving spiritually, practically, and there's evidence for it, and you could see it in the world. I think when you put the two positions into like a juxtaposition and compare and contrast the two worldviews, one clearly stands out as being more in correspondence with the nature of reality and what we know, but from biological evolution to spiritual evolution to an acceptance of science, to a diversity of spiritual perspectives, which is some of what I want to get into.
Yeah.
Can we get into the
Dawahwise
thing all right, cool. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this conversation that you had, if we may. And so the conversation, talks about, you being, you understanding that there's a diversity of Islam, that, that even in contrast to Islamophobia, that's a concern that you have and you don't want to contribute to it, which is great. Now, when you begin to, how do you think, why don't you start? How do you think the conversation went? Where did the conversation start? I have my notes in front of me, and we'll get into some of the issues.
So I think the conversation originally was pretty decent. And then because we were trying to get each other's perspective, and that was going well enough. I think there was a point where it got a little sidetracked with this, and I think it was mostly from Hashim.
We're going to cover that thoroughly.
Yeah. So where he was really focused on the nature of Sanskrit and the rishis and
the Veda.
Yeah.
The eternality of the Veda.
Yeah. And
it was a very ironic debate, because Khalq al-Quran is an issue that is historical in the Islamic tradition. I like somebody watching a football or basketball game.
Yeah.
I wasn't screaming at the screen. I was like, Mukunda, ask him if the Quran is eternal or uncreated. Do it. You did it once. It was never answered.
Right.
And here's the thing: you said 5 times. I'm fast forwarding into the middle of the conversation. I don't want to go there. If we can get there, if we can,
we'll get there.
So you got me started on that topic.
Yeah, so we'll get there. But I mean, on the general, so that's where it got derailed. And then Sharif Abu Layth came on, and then
he conceded your point.
Right.
So Sharif conceded your point, steelmanned your argument.
Right.
But did not tell Hisham that he was wrong. But we're gonna get there.
Yeah. So I actually, so it's interesting because then I started
learning. And they avoided the Khalq al-Quran issue.
Right. So that was. I mean, we'll get to that point. But I thought for the first half was fine. We're going back and forth and was just general conversation.
Let's get into. This is where I see you start. The conversation starts off with Muhammad, who seemed like a very decent individual. He starts talking about how we have absolute truth, right? That was the first thing. And then he said certainty, right?
Yes.
So there's 2 things. My first question would be to him, what do you mean by certainty, right? Do you mean philosophical certainty? Because I don't know of Muslims claiming philosophical certainty, right?
I think they're textual certainty, right? The transmission.
Right, so that's probably, or do you mean yaqeen in an Islamic context?
Yeah.
Right, and usually when you talk about yaqeen, which is certainty in an Islamic context, it's spoken of in the context of what's known as ihsan, right? And so they have ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, and haqq al-yaqeen. And all of these are spiritual in essence, right? They are, as you were describing, that they were esoteric. Right. The type of yaqeen that the Muslims have in their corpus is an esoteric kind, and that could have been brought up in the wait a second, that you guys also have, in terms of certainty, you have an esoteric certainty,
right?
But
yes. Right, so sorry everyone, we had a little technical difficulties. We're back.
Okay, we're back. So we were talking about certainty in terms of what the Muslims meant by it. I'm sure that they have verses where they extrapolate what they mean by yaqeen. However, I know that traditionally the Muslims have described it in the way that you were describing it, that yaqeen or certainty in the context of ihsan, ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, haqq al-yaqeen, which is more esoteric in nature, right? Rather than some type of theological certainty or philosophical certainty. But if it's certainly I don't think that they would say philosophical certainty, but if they say theological certainty via scriptures, I would like to see what that doctrine of yaqeen is, just for
your context. Purposes. So what happened is, on the previous time I came on, we talked about this very briefly, and then I had a conversation with Muhammad afterwards about the nature of certainty, and I wanted to understand what their textual certainty was, because they claimed that the texts and the transmissions were absolutely certain, and they were infallible. So that's why I wanted to understand what that was. And this is what they were explaining to me about the nature of that, I think.
Okay, so but the thing is, yaqeen as a doctrine, I would like, if that's what Muslims mean by certainty or yaqeen, I would just like to have, what is the doctrine of yaqeen in this context, right? Because the yaqeen that I'm familiar with is the ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, haqq al-yaqeen. If the Muslims could expound on it. I'm not refuting them on this issue. If the Muslims could have expounded on that so that we could better understand. Obviously, we share between the Hindu tradition or the Dharmic tradition and the Islamic tradition here an esoteric type of knowledge that is just that we can say is yaqeen or certainty at that level. Perhaps you would, I'm not going to go there, but that's kind of where absolute truth, I think you did great. We established that there is absolute truth,
right,
and relative perception of that truth.
Correct.
Right. Somewhat established it. Now we're going to get into what Abdul Rahman says with regards to his experience contradicting your experience in just a moment. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we get into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we discussed also that point that, I mean, this all stems from what we're first talking about, epistemology, right?
Sure, yeah,
about let's
start with epistemology.
Yeah, what is the ways we can know things? And are these methods of knowing certain for all areas, some areas, and how do they relate to each other, correct?
Right.
So,
and there's an epistemic limitation with regards to the truth that we can ascertain, right? And so therefore, perhaps, and some people take this approach, that we can only have a pragmatic way to live our life, right? So I would actually kind of take that perspective. I think that theology is erroneous, right? As I said before, that I don't think that when we get to the pearly gates, St. Peter is going to ask us about our theology or have us take a theological exam, right? I don't think that our salvation is contingent on figuring out what the mystery behind the universe is. So what the pragmatic way of living our life, now that is orthopraxy, that is something that is a little bit more, not that we shouldn't have theological and philosophical conversations to arrive at a better, refined understanding of truth and debate these issues. But in terms of one's salvation or liberation, being contingent on such a thing, I think is absurd.
So yeah, I would say it's not that salvation is dependent on theology. I would say theology gives you a way to have a proper orthopraxy, right? So, for example, like if you have the Advaitic sense or Vishwadvaitic sense of what the world is and what your relationship to Bhagavan or Ishvara or Brahman and the world on the whole is, then your engagement changes, right? Fundamentally, like if you like within the Vishishtadvaitic sense, if there are three fundamental entities, Brahman, Jiva, and Jagat, and Jiva and Jagat are dependent realities upon Brahman, and all this is Brahman itself, then how we engage with the world and how we engage with each other changes, because we're no longer separate entities. We're no longer beings that are unconnected, unrelated, the othering of each other. We suddenly have this deep connection built by divinity.
Right.
Very core, right?
But see, I'm not sure if that is something that we intellectually arrive at as a concept necessarily.
We do, but that's why
experience of life and the pragmatism.
But it's both, right? Within the Hindu tradition, it's very much the theological basis and the philosophy isn't mental like exercise or masturbation. It's meant for the purposes of, like any of these texts start with Ato Brahma Jignasa, which is Brahma Sutra, right? Which means after knowing, you engage, after doing thus, you engage in the knowledge of Brahman. So what is the purpose of, or even Sankhya Karika is, dukkha traya abhigata hetu, right? The purpose, why do you want to learn about Samkhya or any of these things is to find a way to get salvation. So knowledge is not knowledge for knowledge's sake. Knowledge is there so that we can do something with it and change either our mindset, our actions, or our practices. So the purpose of knowledge isn't to feel great in our mind that we've solved something, but it's to allow us to change our own behavior and our own practices so that we can hit the goal we want to hit. Right.
It changes one's perception and view of the world that you're living in as it pertains to dukkha, suffering, death, those types of things. Unity,
but then your behavior changes, right? How do you
behavior and cognitive processes?
Right. So you might not.
There is a transformation from belief, right?
So that's the purpose.
Right. So that would, but my contention is that in theory, right, there could be an atheist without all of this metaphysical presupposition,
absolutely,
who could live a life
100%
that doesn't require presuppositions or metaphysical propositional beliefs, right?
Absolutely
It
true.
doesn't require it, and that's where the pragmatic value of how one lives their life. And even Jordan Peterson, look, I don't agree with everything Jordan Peterson says, right? But one area that I do, or two areas, significant areas, are that I love his psychoanalytic approach to the text, right? It's another way to approach the text, and I like well, he does seem to be a person who is more about the pragmatism in terms of the how does the way that you live your life, how do you behave as a result of what you profess, so, right? What are the results that you get?
But
that's a very dharmic thing.
Yeah, but I'll put one caveat here, right? Is that's all true. Like everyone can behave rationally and compassionately and endearing without having any of these theological bases, right? But within the dharmic context, the view comes also down to what's your goal, right? If your goal is to be a good person and continue the samsara, then that's all that matters. You don't need to believe in anything. You can just do good actions and you'll get better lives and better rebirths and whatever. But if your goal is to break free of samsara, right? Like whether nirvana, moksha, whatever you want to call it, then your mindset fundamentally matters. Because the reason it matters is agency is the cause of all samsara and karma, right? In that sense, is the nature that I am the doer, I am the one that's like making the actions, then you get the response to that. So even Advaita tradition, why Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Karma Yoga is to separation of the ego, that it is not me doing anything. It's not me that's feeling these things, or it's not me like acting in this world. It is the unity of the self, the supreme being, the ground of all being. That's all this is playing this out. And so that is what gives you that salvation, not the just pure behavior.
Just being a decent person and contributing to society, and
which is very important, by the way. It's not to
Now, granted, I think that inner peace, what we can broadly call inner peace, would be a similar to a yogic state of living one's moment-to-moment experience, however that is achieved, right? That inner level of contentment, equanimity. If one can ascertain these things, technically you would be in that yogic state, right? But I do agree with you that beliefs have consequences. Thoughts have consequences, both in terms of one's energy, one's health, and in terms of how you interact and interface with the world that you're in. So beliefs do have consequences. However, I think that the imagination as it pertains to the model of God, right? What is the nature of God? Right? Is God everything, in everything, out of everything? Is everything in God? Subjective idealism. Is God a trinity? Does the Tawheed make more sense? I don't think that those metaphysical beliefs about the nature of God have eternal consequences, the way that the Abrahamic theologians, mainly of a Christian, not I hate to use Abrahamic because Jews don't believe that we're going to hell, right? It's certain majority denominations within Christianity and Islam take this perspective, right? So that's the problem that I have that's the only problem that I have, Mukunda. I don't talk negatively about Prophet Muhammad. I say sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I have no, like the main issue is the exclusivity. You take away the exclusivity and you have an all-inclusive Islam. What is the kuffar? The issue of kuffar and mushrikeen goes away. You know, and
but I think that's what most I would say Hindus also have an issue with that, or even Buddhists would be like the exclusivity claims are the problem. Like there's a
exclusivity of salvation or liberation specifically, not exclusivity of truth, which I don't. So my perspective is that there is a worldview that is more approximate or corresponding to the nature of reality, right? And there could be worldviews that are in error, right? Not all so the perennial philosophy does not say that all religions are the same, that they're all theological perspectives are teaching the same thing. The perennial philosophy simply says that there is a mystical experience of oneness that is at the heart of the mystical traditions in all religions and cultures. That's it, right? Universalism says that whether through the process of reincarnation, purgatory, or some type of hell, that eventually all is reconciled unto the divine. And pluralism says that there are many paths to God. That's it.
All three things are within Hinduism.
Logically
right?
consistent.
Yeah. All logically
does do
consistent.
not violate the law of non-contradiction.
No.
So here's the thing, Mukunda, you broke some really great ground in this conversation with Dawahwise, because on your main 3 points, you had a concession from the Muslims that your perspective is logically coherent and consistent. Therefore, it does not violate the rules of logic and it is rational, right? Yeah. That doesn't mean that it's true, right? But they backed away into saying that your perspective is logically coherent and we cannot have a logical argument.
Sorry, guys, we had another technical difficulty. It seems to be a day of technical difficulties today. So sorry about that. Yeah, so we last left off, we're just talking basically about the nature of their epistemology and, getting into, what we see as, I would say it comes down to, we have these various different traditions we're talking about, like whether it's the Abrahamic traditions and their exclusivism towards truth, and their more so their exclusivism towards salvation is where we left off. So if you want to continue with that.
So yeah, I mean, that's been my biggest issue, and so I said that I don't have problems with Muslims, and I said I say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam after Muhammad, and Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, stuff like that. I wish nothing but prosperity and success and blessings for people who follow the tradition. But where I recall, my only issue is mainly exclusivity. You know how a lot of ex-Muslims are going after Muhammad, they're going after the Quran, they're going after the worldview, in ethical issues, moral issues, bringing it up, maybe contradictions that they perceive. That's not my route. I've never taken that route. I'm completely the opposite of apostate prophet, or even Hadr Sultan. I'm not, my approach to these issues, including Muslims and Islam, is radically different than them. Now, granted, I get along with atheists, right? I don't think that there's a problem with being atheist. So where I was going with the conversation, Dawah-wise, this is where I recall us leaving off, was rather than that point, I was talking about the conversation that you were having with Dawah-wise. Yeah. And I said that I listened to the 4-hour conversation and I was trying to see where the topics would go and what would happen of them. And from what I saw was that there was a concession on almost every point that you made. And let's talk about those points, right? Almost. We're going to get back to the justification in epistemology, because that's where it's going to culminate to, right? That's where it started with regards to epistemology and justification, and then that's where it ended up going, which is good and it's important. But in terms of logical consistency and coherence, do you remember me talking about this? Logical consistency and coherence of the argument itself as being a logical possibility, rather than it violating the law of non-contradiction, that it was consistent logically, right? And I know, Mukunda, you did bring up para-consistent logic, and Abdurrahman even brought up that this isn't an issue of para-consistent logic, rather your argument fits within the realm of classical or Aristotelian logic, and I agreed with him. Sure. Right. But before you get into that para-consistent thing and we go on that tangent, I want to focus on the most important part, which is the concessions and the topic of the concession, right? So, for example, when you were asked, you say that God has form but doesn't have form. You say that God has attributes but doesn't have attributes. In my mind, the Ibn Arabi saying of huwa la huwa, of God being the universe and yet not being the universe at the same time, is not a contradiction, a logical contradiction, in the sense that the logicians would say something can't be P and not P at the same time, right? That it's not violating that principle, right? And that is kind of what you were trying to demonstrate. And so when you were asked about how is God have form and yet is formless, how does God have attributes but does not have attributes, the concession was made that fits within the realm of logic, right? To the extent that Abdurrahman, who you were talking to, you even emphasized the word, all of that is fine, right? That's how he said it, right? It's just that how do we jump to this metaphysical baggage, right? So the most important thing is that that there's an acknowledgement on the Muslim side that there's logical consistency, coherence, and doesn't violate the rationality of the law or non-contradiction, right? That's the most important thing, right? After that, we can try to justify it. We'll eventually get to justification, but that was a concession. That whole argumentation ended up conceding to your point that this is logically possible. Number two was the cyclical or perpetual creation model. Right. And there was a concession to that this is logically consistent, that there's, not necessarily a problem with it. Logically speaking, it's a possibility, right? But again, how do we justify it? So long as we say that there's a concession there with regards to logical consistency, again, I think that is a major step, right, to be taken. So those were your main 2 points. We're going to get back to absolute truth and justification and epistemology eventually, and why should we take this metaphysical baggage versus the other metaphysical baggage? How do we jump from a necessary being or an initial cause to the religion of Islam, which you guys didn't cover for this podcast, right? You kind of ended on you ended you started in the sense that you brought it up, right? And so in terms of what their justification for their metaphysical baggage would have to be a conversation as much as justification for our metaphysical baggage, which we can touch on in this conversation. But so long as we agree on the logical coherence and a lack of violation of the law of non-contradiction, I think we're good so far, right? And and not only is there logical coherence, but Abdurrahman also says very clearly that you have this notion of perpetual creation model in the context of Islam as well, right? He says that. Now, granted, you also have the notion of huwa la huwa as just an analogy in the context of Islam as well, with regards to it not being the equivalent of a logical contradiction, saying P but not P. So that's all. So that's already within the realm of the Daira of Islam. So the next thing that happens is, I think his name is Hashim. Or is it Hisham? I don't remember.
Sure.
I'm not going to go back to the video. I'm going to call him Hisham. That's what I'm going to call him, Hisham. So that's when he jumps in, and this is where it kind of became comical, right? The Zakir Naik type of mentality enters the fray.
Sure.
So it took you 5 times, right, as you said, trying to explain how pre-language, the word Veda means what? Knowledge.
It just means knowledge. Yeah.
Right.
It's the same root as video.
No,
right?
Yeah.
Video means to see, to know.
Veda is knowledge.
Yeah.
It's knowledge that exists prior to language, that then at some point in time and space, right?
Yeah.
In the context of India, the rishis apprehend it. Right.
Correct.
It's and what was great was that Sharif, after 30 minutes of nonsense, comes back onto the channel, and then steel mans your argument for the audience. Right.
All right. Again, we had some technical difficulties, but we're back at it. All right. Go ahead, Farhan.
All right, cool, bro. Yeah. So we were talking about Hisham and the conversation about the Sanskrit as a language, coming in, being a part of the world, right? And therefore it couldn't have pre-existed, and so on and so forth. And he was bringing that up. Hopefully you caught the majority of what I was saying.
Yeah. Was
that Sharif comes on, steel mans your argument, doesn't acknowledge that Hisham was wrong, but at least steel mans your argument. And again, talks to the logical consistency and coherence of what is being said, right? Now, what boggled my mind most about this conversation, and how all the Muslims just sat there with you sitting on their hands, is that the conversation about Khalq al-Quran, whether the Quran is created or uncreated, is one of the first theological issues that comes up in the history of Islam. Right. The Mu'tazila would say that the Quran was created. The Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah would say that the Quran is uncreated. Now, granted, there might be nuance in that conversation, that but the point, and then they have this concept of Lawh al-Mahfuz, which is a pre-language, pre-Arabic existing reality, right, of kitab, right, a book, of Revelation, right, similar to the what you were arguing, right, and for the Muslims to sit there and say that we don't have this, pretend like you guys don't have this in the history of your theological discourse, the same exact issue, and would have the same, almost the same answer that some of your theologians would, that Mukunda is giving, that wasn't acknowledged was either unfortunate, meaning that they knew that's an issue that they have, or they were just being quiet because they didn't want Hisham to look foolish. Right. So it is what it is. So again, another concession with regards to the topics that were discussed. And let me see. So then after that, Sharif comes on, and then you talk about source of morality and stuff like that. Similarities between Hinduism and Buddhism. You brought up the whole divine. Now, obviously, I differ with you on the whole divine command theory thing. That scriptures are necessary for us to verify morals and ethics. Right? I believe in an intersubjective conversation that leads to social contracts, similar to what.
Well, it's not to say that. So again, this is where it's like. So there is two elements here, right? The purpose of what traditional within Hindu thought, Mamsakas and Vedantins would say is scripture is necessary to know right and wrong, because we can't reason it. Because whatever we can reason to, we can reason out of. So that's been a lot of their positions. So there has to, if the truth exists, there has to be ways to know. We can't physically know it because we can't see right or wrong.
But the scripture telling us that something's good or bad, I just don't like that whole notion.
So the idea of good or bad, again, does not here mean what one should do or shouldn't do. The good or bad here means what's the consequences, right? Like, for example, like if you were to do killing someone, you have no sense that in your next life you might be killed or this would occur, right? There's no way to know that. So the idea is the text will give you that information. So because it's
in
beyond
terms of divine justice, accountability and divine justice, right?
So we know that the karma plays out in this life. So we know there's consequences. So it's not to say that it'll tell you exactly what's going to play out here, because we have so much, this storehouse of unburnt karma that's constantly being filled and burning a little bit. But the idea is how we should think about not right or wrong in this world, right? So but our behavior,
accountability as it pertains to
how do I know I need to be good to everybody else, or not to that violence is acceptable in some forms but not others, right? Is to say that we have to have a sense of context.
But the reason takes a place, and the reason in dialectic and discourse,
right? But
the way Richard Dawkins would say, "I don't want my morality to be debated."
Right.
I want
but there's some extremes that people will say, well, the objective reality of ahimsa being always right is something you can't know, right? You can't know through any dialectic that one must always try to be non-cruel. It has to be.
Well, where we would agree is that there's morality and there's a grounding for morality.
Right.
That's where we would all agree.
Right.
And the more morality issue is a very long one. Right. But that's what you and Sharif got into.
Right.
As long as we agree that there's morality in the ground for morality, and you can talk about, and you mentioned, for example, the Muslims that are not familiar, look at the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, look at the yamas and niyamas within the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and look at that in comparison to what you guys have in your tradition, and you would be astonished, right? Compare it to tazkiyatun nafs, right? Self-purification. And this is where orthopraxy, as being more relevant than aqidah or theology, in my view, in pragmatism, as in contrast to a certain belief about the nature of God as it pertains to one's liberation and salvation, is just not something that is worthy. That is metaphysical baggage that is absolutely unnecessary, right? And that's when we talk about the metaphysical baggage that Islam brings to the table and how unnecessary and without justification, the only route is that you have to somehow prove the book to be true, divine, and whatever the book said, just like the Christians in the Bible, right? It's not that there's no need to jump to that, right? Until they bring their evidence, so that is the purpose of the world and the universe and all of the galaxies and the multiverse is so that a bloodline of prophets in the Middle East could dictate rights and wrongs in specific theology in terms of how you need to conceptualize the divine in your mind. Let's get back to Abdul Rahman and your conversation about experiencing God.
Oh, experiencing God. Okay, yeah.
That's one of the most simple, because you and Abdul Rahman went back and forth on that, and I felt like that was you were kind of speaking over each other.
Sure.
And I want to kind of hone it back on and how that does not violate anything in terms of the law of non-contradiction, right? And we can kind of go back and forth and see what you think about this. Mm-hmm. So Abdurrahman says that his experience might contradict your experience of God. Sure. You said that all experience is real, right?
Right.
And so where I think Abdurrahman was not following is that, listen, I do not worship a concept of God, right? I don't worship the concept of Advaita.
Yeah.
Right. In no way does a Christian worship a concept of the Trinity, nor does a Hindu worship a concept of Brahman or Advaita, or nor does a Muslim worship a concept of Tawheed. Right. They're not thinking of the concept in their mind as they're praying to God or worshiping the divine.
Right.
That worship and acknowledging of the divine from a subjective point of view is without language. It's without doctrine. It is esoteric, right? So when a Christian prays to Jesus, right, it's not about the word Jesus. It's not about the concept of the Trinity. It's about an esoteric process of one yearning for the divine. That's all that it is.
Right.
Right? You could use the word Jesus. You could use the word Brahman. You could use the word Allah, but it's just a word, right, that human beings are using to connect to the divine. So what I would say is that Abdurrahman's experience is a limited experience. Everybody's experience is a limited experience, right? And some experiences might be a little bit more limited in terms of understanding as compared to other models, right? So I would even go to the extent of saying that Abdurrahman's interpretation not only is fallible and limited, but it is categorically incorrect, right? So when he says that my experience tells me Hinduism is correct, there's no experience that's going to tell you, quote unquote, there's not going to be like an ilham or a wahi. Hinduism is wrong. That's not a mystical experience. No. The experience of being, or I am, is without words, without doctrine, without concepts, without a name, without a language.
Right. It's direct experience of a thing.
Yeah.
Without conceptual frameworks, right? Like
exactly.
It's very, very clearly. It's okay. It's like me.
It's ineffable.
This cup. I see the cup, but I don't think red. I don't think cup.
Yeah.
I observe.
You observe and experience. There is knowledge that comes with the experience, right? Sure. And this is perennial, right? Cross-cultural research, qualitative meta-analysis can be done on this, right? If you want to take the scientific route on just demonstrating that this is a phenomenon, right? Objectively speaking, we can do that. So cross-culturally, historically, you name it, right? And even in the scientific measures, Johns Hopkins of psychedelic studies, they use this on their scales, right? The mystical unitive experience, right? So there's something to be said of it. So there is evidence that we can bring on the table. We can have an intersubjective conversation. And even my intersubjective conversation with the Vedas, Jalaluddin Rumi, Wahdatul Wujud, is it's me having a subjective experience and comparing somebody else's subjective experience to the broader conversation. Whether it's Ibn Arabi, whether it's Jalaluddin Rumi, whether it's Shankara, whether it's Ramanuja Acharya, there is the knowledge and the experience of the divine, and then the interpretation and articulation of that. Right. Even for me, when I had the psychedelic experience, I was only then that I was able to look at the philosophical discourse of it to appreciate it. Right. And so Abdurrahman's interpretation of the experience could be faulty. Right. Mm-hmm. But the experience nevertheless is real. Right. And I agree with you that there are experiences of non-duality, and then there's layers of which duality can emerge, of the divine with the ego, right? But when the ego dissolves, what the Sufis call fana fillah, or in psychedelic research, it's called the ego death, right? Or in samadhi, where the ahamkar is gone, that is a common experience across cultures that we can now then talk about. Abdurrahman can have that experience and interpret it according to his metaphysical baggage, but that doesn't mean that his interpretation is right or accurate. And so there's no logical contradiction in that. I would simply say, Abdurrahman, your interpretation of your experience of God, though real and valuable in terms of your inner transformation, your behavior, cognitive changes that are necessary as a result of spiritual and mystical experiences, that while all of that is valid, your metaphysical worldview is just, from my perspective, wrong, right? That's what I would say.
Right.
God is not a deity outside of you, judging you, thinking that you are wrong for having the wrong theology or nuance to metaphysical worldview. I mean, there's no reason to believe that or take on that metaphysical baggage at all. Thoughts on Abdurrahman's on my insight on that?
No, I think that's fair. So I think at some point, yeah, we kind of were talking past each other, I would say. And you know, I think that's fair. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't want to add more words to something that doesn't need to be said.
Okay. All right. So with all of that said, I watched the 4 hours. Those were the main points. If I missed anything, right? We were talking about the nature of God in a monistic model.
Right.
Doesn't violate the rules of logic. We brought up perennial philosophy, Spinoza, subjective idealism, Vishishta Advaita,
Sure.
Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism in terms of Shunyata, the Neoplatonic model of the philosophers, the Greek philosophers,
and later
the monad and emanation and gradation. That all of these are subjective idealism. All of this is within the ballpark of a similar model, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the other model is a model where at some point, as Christopher Hitchens says, after all of the chaos and disaster for millions and millions of years, eventually mankind comes onto the scene, and now God wants to talk to certain sentient beings and wants to dictate his law through an individual that other people must now accept. Right. And that's the narrative, with no reason to believe it. Right. What do they cite? Miracles that we cannot verify, except for, in the conversation, he says the Quran. Right. And that's a conversation to be had. Right. That's a conversation to be had. And whether they are making an argument to convince themselves, right, or whether this is something that can be objectively verified. Right.
I mean, like for me, like again, like since I don't know Arabic,
know the details of
I don't know Arabic. I don't know how Arabic linguistically works.
Yeah.
It's not a point I'm going to have issue with. I'm going to be like, okay, like this is the tradition. That's what the tradition believes. So I'll accept it. Right. It just, I don't have anything contradictory to say to that.
But the evidence isn't persuasive, right? The arguments that they will bring are not persuasive. Hamza Sortsi's in company have said there's no science in the Quran, completely doing away with
no, at one point they all said there was science in the Quran.
Embryology. No. But they had to, the philosopher, the Hamza Sortsi's in the Neo-Athari crowd that Muhammad Hijab follows, that are indulging in Ibn Sina's arguments, which is contrary to the Salafi manhaj. That whole group is making this, is trying to make this attempt. And so yeah. So where was I going with this? Sorry about this. It's been a couple. Where was I going with that, Mukunda?
No, I think we're just talking about like generally the end of the conversations and the, do we cover everything that we're covering within
we were coming to justification, right?
Yeah.
That's where we're eventually coming to. Okay, so the two models of God, right? This whole, you're in God is in judgment of you. He's outside of you, wants you to have the right akida and theology. Yeah. That whole notion versus a notion that we're evolving spiritually, as individuals, the Jivatma, and as a collective, right? And in that the path is self-awareness rather than
but it's circular
being
again,
a slave
right?
of Allah.
But it's, again, this is all circular. There's going to be ebbs and flows of all this, right? There's progress, and then goes back into evolving.
Yeah, you brought that up in terms of the cyclical aspect of it, right? So there's evolution and de-evolution and all that kind of stuff, expansion and contraction. But nevertheless, we are seeing in our biological, philosophical, technological reality an evolution of the world as we know it. And apparently we can evolve in every category, but we can't evolve in religion, right? We have to go back to 7th century Arabia in order to have religion and spirituality and God, right? And that's the model that Muhammad Hijab and company want to give us, right? And they can dispute me on any of this, right? But we could, but these are the two world views that we're dealing with, right? Not only that, they want to boast conversions and the spread of the religion. My perspective is that in my personal, I know that it's not Hinduism or Buddhism per se. We can talk about the spectrum of what, say, New Age spirituality with the astrology and the crystals and the tarot cards and the divination versus the spirituality of Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is Awe and Wonder. The book Waking Up that Sam Harris wrote, different kind of spirituality than what the New Agers would talk about, right? But what I'm saying is that is within the spirit of what Hinduism and Buddhism have brought to the table, right? I agree with you that mindfulness and meditation and self-awareness is not that the Buddhism is much more richer than that and deeper than that, and has metaphysics with regards to existential realities as it pertains to those questions. That's fine. But as far as the world that I'm living in, with regards to yoga, meditation, mindfulness, perceiving a world of energy and vibes rather than a world of judgment. These are two different worldviews. World of vibes versus a world of judgment, right? A world of diverse thought rather than you can only think one way and the religion and the group has to think for you, right? It's either free thought or it's group think, and they want group think, right? In terms of psychology. So these are the worldviews, right? If I had slides, I could present all of this slide by slide, evidence, studies in terms of social science with regard to the human condition, and we can deconstruct and break down the immaturity of one worldview. By immaturity, it's just not developed. It's just, like I said, childlike thought, theology. And another worldview that is holistic, scientific, rational, philosophical, spiritual, and intersubjective confirmations can be made via this worldview. Where the other one is obsolete, archaic, and so on. And so now we come to the justifications, right? So the epistemology, obviously, for me, is Pratyaksha. That's the primary, right? And then after the Pratyaksha, then goes to the qualitative studies that we can do in science and social science, right?
Well, I mean, so Pratyaksha would be scientific observation, right? Because
it would be anecdotal in the sense that I experienced oneness.
Well, so this is where this gets really interesting, right? So Advaita has six pramanas, or six means of knowing. Vishishtadvaita, my tradition, has three, which is Pratyaksha, Anumana, Shabda. And so Pratyaksha is whatever is apprehended directly by the senses, and that includes what's known as Yoga Pratyaksha, which is what can be apprehended in the state of supernormal experience, right? Outside the
there's layers essentially,
right? And then there's Anumana, which is just reasoning, thought process, rationality. And then Shabda, by the way, technically isn't scripture. It means verbal testimony that one has not directly experienced.
Nice.
So it's as if you come and tell me, hey, I just saw a man stab another man, do I take your word as a source of information or not? And I have to determine based upon who's the person speaking, how
the authority of the person who has developed the methodology and the philosophy of what it is being talked about, that then one could verify by looking at. I get that. I get that, but that's in the realm of intersubjective, even if it's historical, right?
Right. So this is where it's interesting, because it's just so far as scripture is seen as being like that. So one of the reasons to justify why the Vedas are considered to be something to be absolute in their sphere, and their only sphere, by the way, is like the two areas that said the nature of the unseen things of the world, which is Brahman, things you can't know in a direct way, and the nature of Dharma. Those two things are the only two things that Shabda has any sort of primacy on. So on this, anything in this world, Shabda can't tell you about. Like if Shabda were to say, like Shankara uses an example, fire is cold. Even if the text says fire is cold, but I touch it, I don't use the text. I have to reinterpret the text to fit my experience. Because
because that's a major difference in how a Muslim would approach the Quran as a text, or as an authority. Right. It's a different definition, it seems. Right.
So this is where Pratyaksha, ultimately, yes, you're right. Everything comes down to Pratyaksha. It's my personal experience of a thing.
Yeah. Of the divine in this context. Right. Yeah. Of divinity or Brahman or ultimate reality.
But even me interacting with you and taking your word as example, or I mean, as a truth or a basis of knowledge I can receive, it has to be an interaction, right? I have to experience it. It doesn't magically just occur. So
Right.
it really comes out to Pratyaksha as being like the foundational pramana.
And it is, that definitely is for me. And I
Yeah.
know it's the first pramana to be even emphasized by in comparison to all of the other pramanas, right? And that's outstanding. And it's definitely one of the hallmarks of Hinduism in terms of having that approach of mysticism and direct
Buddhism does it the same way,
apprehension.
but it's funny for me because Buddhism, they won't say Shabda, but they use the words of Buddha, right?
Right.
It's very interesting because they do the same exact thing.
Of course, yeah.
Like
That's why it's a path of self-awareness, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So all these things have, so even these experiences one has within the Vedas, they can be verified, right?
Sure.
This is not
And
about
that's the point. This is where the justification comes in, right?
Right.
So, okay, yeah, you do. So let's say I have an experience, right?
Yeah.
The unitive experience of oneness, of one might even say use the word divine simplicity. It's something that we haven't used, right? It's ineffable, right? The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. It is ineffable, right? So words cannot do justice to it. And yet, so this is kind of where the paraconsistic logic that you did bring up, we didn't talk about that, where something can't be talked about, but then you still try to talk about it. Right. So, that's kind of how I view it. So, but the experience of divine simplicity, of where there are no attributes of nirguna Brahman, as I would say it, of ego death, of fana fillah, of annihilation of the ego, of the ahamkar, so I've experienced that, right? So now what do I do with this experience that I've had maybe once, maybe more than once, right? Possibly, right? And then there's layers of the experience, right? As well. Obviously, I pursued this through the realm of psychedelics, which, there's caveats, there's nuance. If you're they don't want anybody just doing this without checking with your doctor and understanding your own mental health, all of that, disclaimer, right? But that being said, nor am I encouraging it, this was a path for me. So with that being said, that was my avenue. And so having seen this or experienced it or transcended experience, the way that you want to word it, now what, right? So for me, the way that I've explored it is I studied the perennial philosophy, I studied the world religions, the world perspectives, historical perspectives on this. And I've looked at other testimonies, contemporary friends, research that's been done, meta-analysis that have been done on psychedelics by Hopkins and Mayo Clinic, etc. And in all of that data, the testimonies, the meta-analysis, the qualitative research, the studying of the different traditions, how the Sufis, Rumi apprehended it, how Ibn Arabi apprehended it, how the subjective idealists apprehend it, how the New Agers apprehend it, how the Neoplatonists apprehend it, and so on and so forth. I saw maybe one or two or three models that were pretty much in the ballpark of what the experience is. And so this is my justification, right? That I have reasons to believe this, right? But I have no real reason to believe that if I die today, that Jesus is going to judge me because I didn't accept that he died on the cross for me and for my sins, or that I didn't accept La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah the way that Muslims do, right? Divine command theory, the Quran is an authority, you have to follow it, you have to pray in Arabic 5 times a day, circuit the Kaaba in Ramadan 7 times, fast in the month of Ramadan, if you're a woman, wear hijab, and so on and so forth, right? That whole model, right, is somehow necessary, right? There's no reason for me to accept all of the metaphysical baggage of exclusivity, of hell, of God being separate from you. And I have absolute justification in terms of subjective experience that has been verified through the process that I just explained. Therefore, I have reasons to believe that this worldview makes more sense, is more inclusive, speaks to the human condition, and is verifiable by anybody. We all have within our anatomy and of the brain this possibility, and it can be activated, and that is my justification.
Right.
So yeah, that's kind of where I would take the conversation.
I mean, but that's exactly where I was going to go. At the end of the day, anything we're saying can be verified, can be experienced or falsified. However you want to term this, right? This entire process of yoga, like for example, yoga is a practice. It's a practice you can sit down and do and see if it has results. If it works, if it doesn't work, right?
That's the point. So this is a methodology argument rather than a divine command theory argument.
Right.
I'm doing this because when I apply the methodology, I get results, right? And
Correct.
that's the kind of the relationship between the student and the master, right? The guru and the shishya.
Yeah.
Is that this person has applied these methods on themselves, right? And reached certain results as a regard of the application of that methodology. And they're passing.
But it's also interesting this way too,
to verify it.
Because a lot of times, if you're many legitimate gurus and acharyas, what they will do is if you come to them and you're not ready for it, they'll send you to someone else to go learn from someone else and to practice someone else's, because there's introductory kind of practices that lead you to a certain level of experience, and there's medium level practice, and then there's like intense practices where it's like, your entire world will change. And one of the things that we did discuss very briefly on the prior podcast before I did this particular one with Dawahwise, when it came on the first time, was the nature of reality. What does real mean, right? Like, and I think this is where, like, they try to have fun with it, right? And that's fine, because it's difficult idea to grasp. Is like, for me, my mental reality, my dream reality is just as real as my waking reality. Like, there's this demarcation of like saying this physical world is more real than a dream world, I think is really, really interesting. Because
that we all, like you said, all experiences are real in that one experiences or has experienced these phenomena. Right? Yeah. So absolutely.
And this is where they're like, if you murder someone in the dream, did you murder someone really? Well, in the dream I did. Right. But it doesn't take away.
But in terms of judgment, God's judgment on that, see, that's where their mind is going. Like, did you actually do it?
But that's actually where my argument's saying is, just like that in your dream, if you kill someone, you're not going to be punished. Just like that, God doesn't do that for us, because His world is a dream in that same, because it ultimately it sits with us as if we're experiencing things in God's playland. This Leela, his Leela, his sport.
Leela, it's a movie. But I do. So I do think that there is, at the level of the individual jiva, that there's soul, that there's evolution that's happening. There's soul building, if you want to call it soul building. Theodicy.
You're getting experience points. You're building your character up.
There's learning that's happening. Even in near-death experience, clinical research on NDEs. A person comes back and says that there's lessons to be learned, things still to be accomplished and contributed.
This is soul building.
So soul building. Theodicy, which is even to the problem of evil, right? So, I think that this worldview of evolutionary, of consciousness as being at the ground of being, the way that the world is turning to this perspective. I was saying that in America, I hardly come across Christians and Muslims anymore. Most of the people that I'm coming across are connecting to the divine, to the divine reality, to the universe, to that which is one, the monad, right? And so that we are all one with. And so that I feel like this is enough of a situation for Muslims to start to take this worldview seriously, in terms of apostasy, people leaving Islam, which I don't encourage. I always pray, wallahi, by God, I say to Muslims, I pray that Allah increases the iman of Muslims. Right? I always say that. But my thing is, as people are leaving Islam, as the avalanche comes, and as people begin to apostate, that hedonism and atheism is not a path for everybody. That spirituality, right, and the dharmic traditions, maybe not necessarily. I'm not an evangelical. That maybe that there should be all paths that people can consider. You know what I mean? Rather, when they're going through their spiritual crisis in life. And so I think that conversation needs to be had. I think conversation as it pertains to the nature of reality needs to be had from this perspective. And when it does, Muslims will be in a situation in terms of shubahat, as far as their main, their mainstream theology, mainstream theology, as it has it, they're going to have to deal with a lot of issues.
Right. I'll give you an example. So recently, I saw one of their clips they put out there of this Hindu guy that they're talking about how a baby is responsible for their own suffering, right? And it's part of this is like, you have to learn. This is why I wanted to do these conversations with them, is we have a perspective, And within our perspective, things are logical. Now, we can say whether or not reincarnation is real or not. That's another question, right? That's another that we can talk about. Even Stevenson's research, or all the anecdotal data we have coming out nowadays.
Right.
But I mean, at the end of the day,
I like the cyclical idea better. I'm not a fan of Ian Stevenson's where I don't find it to be persuasive. I think I've said that before.
Okay.
I think that there's a much more literature that's persuasive from the NDE and the psychedelic world, compared to Ian Stevens. Plus, you can use logic and skepticism to kind of deconstruct some of those studies, show the limitations in those studies.
Well, you can do that with anything, but I mean,
I try to be honest with it. But I do think that reincarnation makes more sense than resurrection.
I think logically, yes, in a logical sense,
it doesn't make sense that for eternity, I'm going to be for eternity, I'm going to be a Pakistani American. Now, great. I always say I'm fine with me. I'm fine with the way I look.
I know.
This nose, this forehead, this height.
I get it. I totally get it.
Organism with guts and a heart and a stomach and feet and hair and fingernails. I like this avatar. I want to treat it as if it's sacred, but I don't think that resurrection makes sense compared to reincarnation, unless in a single lifetime. What am I going to accomplish in terms of lesson learning, perspective, soul building within a sliver of time from the year I was born in 1984 until the year that I die?
But this also has issues of like. Right, but you're born with your own inherent limitations, right? You might be born with inherent skepticism, so you skeptic about a lot more things, right? And that's God.
Or I might be born with a lower IQ and I'm philosophically inept.
Right.
So not that there's something wrong with that, right? But I'm just saying that these are situations and circumstances that are relative. That's why I'm skeptical of the resurrection, and I think that reincarnation makes more sense.
Right.
But that's just me. But I wouldn't go Ian Stevenson route in terms of providing evidence for.
Well, I actually find a lot of that evidence to be, I'm not saying persuasive, but I am saying
interesting
that with some promise. Because like at the end of the day, like, our everyday experience, we never have the experience of reincarnation. We don't see that. We don't experience it. We don't.
No doubt. Yeah.
Right. But these studies you've showed, they do point out some anomalies that are very difficult to explain. And
yeah, they're interesting is what I say. They're definitely interesting.
And the truth is, if one of those is true, then our entire structure of the world has to be rethought.
It would be interesting. It would be interesting.
So from my perspective, that's it is, I find it relatively, I would say if it's 50%, 50-50, I think his case are about 51 to 55% persuasive.
Okay.
They're a little above the realm of coin flip.
I mean, I think that there's an evolution of the soul, that it makes sense that you live from lifetime to lifespan time. The body is an illusion. The body and identity, from my perspective, it's an illusion.
Sure.
Right. So there shouldn't be any attachment to it. There is a jivatma. I think that families perhaps travel, atoms or souls may travel together. I think that's all of that's interesting. You know what I mean?
Right, but they have a theory on this, right? Within even the Brahma Sutras about the koshas, about the nature of the koshas and samskaras and vasanas. You have sense remain. So you have the 5 koshas: annamaya, pranamaya, vijnanamaya, anandamaya.
Yeah, the various koshas, the various
because those are all connected to
the various bodies. Yeah, and it's all interconnected. It's all interconnected, and you can experience this.
Yeah,
you can actually experience this, right? Including with I would say that my primary experience is through, again, psychedelics.
So I've done very hardcore meditation before and practice, and I've also done psychedelics. There's been moments where in deep meditation, where especially if it's like visually focusing on particular image or point of focus, right? Where the distance between the two start merging and become almost one. The world around you starts vacillating and vibrating, and it's very similar to what I've had on the couple times I've taken like LSD.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
So
I love meditation, pranayama, all of that. You talked about breathing, and in DMT, the spirit molecule, it's that they talk about how dimethyltryptamine is actually naturally occurring in the lungs and in the pineal gland. And there was ongoing research, but I think some confirmation has come to that.
So
it's interesting
in the
how
Yoga
some of these
Sutras, it's
techniques
also it's interesting because Yoga Sutras say there's a few different ways to have the experience of samadhi. One is through yoga and practice. Other one is through Oshada, or Oshada means medicines or herbs or drugs. But
absolutely,
drugs are not recommended because they lead to reliance on the
reliance. Yeah, I mean, psychedelics don't, from my experience, are not. In the study and research shows that
it's not about addiction.
You need time to process.
No. It's not about
addiction. Desire or craving to do it.
No, it's not about that.
Yeah.
What I mean is reliance to get that experience.
Got you.
It's like a shortcut, right?
It's such a shortcut.
Yeah.
But the time that it would take for meditation and pranayama, and it take lifetimes, though, bro.
Yeah, but the whole point of doing that practice is you steel yourself up, because the experiences, as you know, can be beautiful or they can be hell, right?
True.
And both those things.
But the hell is necessary.
Yes,
for the development of the ego.
But through that process
of the soul.
But through that process of yoga, you learn to control it, to flow it through properly.
No
right?
doubt. No doubt.
Because I will tell you,
so even Sam Harris says this: mindfulness, meditation, the yogic sciences, they help prepare you and to navigate rather than run away, resist, be afraid of. You surrender, which is you search to Islam, right? You surrender to the new experience.
But what is this yoga process, right? The Ashtanga of the yogas?
Yeah, Ashtanga yoga. Absolutely.
It leads to samadhi. There's Ishvara Pradhanani, right?
One of the final surrendering, exactly.
Because through your focus, through your concentration, through your you get
through your heart space, right?
Yes.
Through your heart space,
so all these things,
the
yamas, they help form your character, which allows you to then think about when you have these thoughts, your thoughts no longer as
Chitta vritti nirodha.
Yeah, exactly.
The thoughts, there's a cessation of thoughts.
Cessation, yeah.
There's stillness, as the Buddhists call it.
Yes.
Right. No, absolutely. And in psychedelics, that stillness is very apparent on the lower levels.
Yes.
That's still when it's phenomenal. There's no words. But nevertheless, we've demonstrated that there is a path to justification for this worldview, and we can really articulate it. I can get slides out, right? My thing is, I don't want to debate Muslims. The only ones that I want to debate are the ones who are dogmatic, fundamentalist, to put them in their place. That's kind of what but in terms of general, like Abdurrahman, Yallah Habib, go live Islam. It's a beautiful tradition. You want to have a philosophical conversation about the nature of reality, we could do it. But I have no debate with you. I have no quarrels with you. I don't think that your Islam is dangerous. I'm not worried about your Islam. I want to help you against Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. And we're in a good place. You know what I mean? That's where it is for the most part. But if you really want to enter the world of comparing worldviews, I don't think that there's a comparison, man. There's one that is clearly more coherent, more clear, more corresponding and approximate to what we know subjectively and intersubjectively and objectively. And I think I would like to see how Muslims deal with it. Unfortunately, nobody stepped up. You know what I mean?
You reach out to them? Have you tried?
Who? I reached out to Mohammed Hijab. The other people, they all tell me to come to Speaker's Corner. I'm like, all right, how about you drop everything that you're doing, right? It's all your obligations. Take a flight, take the next flight over to Washington, D.C. for a freaking debate. Like, get out of here, dude. You're not that important, nor is refuting you that important to me.
I mean, I'll ask these guys if they'll have you on with me next time.
Oh. Yeah, and here's my thing. I have, my debate is not hostile. I'm not hostile towards Islam and Muslims. I hope they understand that. I think
we don't need to be having a debate. We're just having a discussion along the lines of what I was doing before.
It's not I mean, you had a fair discussion, but in terms of worldviews, I'm not hesitant in saying, that I think that this is a more correct approximation.
Ultimately, yes, I'm on the same page as you. That's what I believe. But in order to make myself more knowledgeable, I should understand other people's perspectives.
No doubt.
And then see what if anything are they saying that can refine my thought or dissuade me of a notion that's incorrect, whatever. It's important to engage in that sense.
Okay. All right. So, no, I'm with you completely. Like, if they'll have me on, I'll be on.
Yeah.
All right. I would rather talk to the ones that are a little bit more philosophical than the Zakir Naik type of Dawah.
Sure.
But yeah, so we'll see what happens. If so, cool. If not, I'm not even, like I said, it's the only one that I would challenge is Muhammad Hijab. I'm not challenging anybody else to a debate. I think if we can have a conversation about the nature of reality, the human condition, which is where my knowledge is, the human condition, and the implications of the human condition on divine justice.
Right.
That's where I'm gonna go. And it pertains to universal reconciliation rather than hellfire for theology, right? And then we can deal with the nature of reality. Is it Advaita, or within the ballpark of monism, even if qualified, or even if emanationism, right? Even if there's a conditioned reality, unconditioned reality. I love the Neoplatonists, so long as we acknowledge some degree of oneness with the monad. Or the reality being a reflection of the monad, something along those lines. It's all good. I think we can talk about the nature of reality and provide a better justification for it compared to the metaphysical baggage that you're making a jump from necessary being and from cause of all things to an intelligent designer, or that moral lawgiver, whatever you want to give, to the Islamic conception that you have to believe in an Aqidah, right, and pray in Arabic 5 times a day, and go to Mecca and make 7 circuits, have the intention of going to Mecca and making 7 circuits around the Kaaba, and so on and so forth. These exoteric forms, both theologically and physically, that these exoteric forms are necessary, rather than the esoteric essence that is perennial and universal across traditions. I would challenge them on that. They will not step up to the plate. Let's go.
Okay.
All right. All right, Mukunda. All right, let me ask you this. Do you have any questions about Islam? Now, I'm not going to come up to you as a scholar, right? I'm not. Just to entertain. Like, what are your general questions to Muslims? Just out of curiosity. I'm not going to give, I'm not going to approach this as a scholar. Just out of curiosity, what are your questions about Islam?
It'd be nature of, what is the nature of God? And like, how does God connect to you? Is there a relationship? Is there total difference? Is there a chasm that can't be crossed? And then if that's the case, then why did God create? What is, if God is all knowledge, why does he create good people and bad people? And I know there's free will, but his knowledge should, I know everyone uses Plantinga as middle knowledge and this and that nowadays, but like, what does it mean to be all knowledge, to have omniscience, and yet basically will evil into the world? Because you cannot have God that has a will that's separate from reality.
No, I don't see it either. I don't see that, you have 2 separate entities. You have God, and then you have the universe, right?
Yeah.
Potentially a multiverse, but at least a universe, right? 2 entities, right? That's not 1, but 2, right? 2 existences, 2 realities. This is shirk, right? There's only one, as far as I'm concerned, right? There's only one. Right. To say otherwise is shirk. So, and worshiping your Aqidah, worshiping your beliefs, right? So Sharif brought this up. Hindus have issues with beliefs. That's not true. You and I just delved philosophically into a number of issues. The Hindus have delved into philosophy throughout the history of Hinduism, right? When Al-Biruni from the Muslim world came to study Bharat, India, he, in his book Tariq-e-Hind, he distinguishes the Muslims have what they call sami'na wa ata'na. We hear and we obey, the blind followers, right? So Hinduism has people who are doing rituals and are blindly following what they've inherited. And then Biruni says, but the philosophical Muslims, now this is interesting, right? And so now, when we deal with the philosophical Hinduism and the Hinduism of mysticism, so here's the thing about philosophical, right, versus mystical. And the Muslims have it too. You have ilm al-kalam and the philosopher, and then you have irfan amongst the Shia and tasawwuf amongst the Sufis, right? So y'all have both too, right? they're both important enterprises with regards to a holistic understanding of God. So it's not that Hindus are antithetical to beliefs or conceptualizations, right? It's what the issue is the same thing, that God is not judging you on your theology, right? Your ability to apprehend a theological framework of God, that is of the nature of God. That's not what's happening here, right? So where was I going with this, Mukunda?
Oh no, we're just talking about the what's his name? Sharif responding back to
yeah. Wait, Sharif responding back to you on beliefs,
beliefs,
So yeah, like even some of the gurus say that it's not about your beliefs, it's about your experience, which is mystics say that in general, perennial philosophers say that in general, but that doesn't undermine rationality. Like Hamid al-Ghazali even said, Ghazali would say that even the Muslims in your podcast said that logic has its, we take logic to its limit, and then spirituality, theology, and all of that comes in. So, I mean, I would say the same thing, that logic has its limit, and then that's where mysticism, even for not Rumi or Ghazali, it makes everything more full, right? The mysticism does, the direct experience of the divine, right? So it's interesting. It's interesting. So that's kind of my approach to it all. What's interesting is that this New Age terminology is slowly creeping into the Islamic world as it has in the Christian world, this Hindu terminology. Hamza Sortsis wrote a book called The Divine Reality, right? I've never heard of reality being called the divine reality in the history of Islam. Show me the Quranic equivalent of this concept of divine reality, right? There is Allah, and then there's creation. So that very title of his book, The Divine Reality, is a Hindu, Buddhist, New Age influence that the world is currently experiencing. And so I want Muslims to know that meditation is coming your way. Mindfulness is coming your way. These Hindu ideas are coming your way. I'm all for it. I know that there's criticism in India about diluting the tradition. I think traditionalists are in general worried about that. But I want to see these healing modalities, these awakening modalities.
There's space across the world to have the traditionalists and non-traditionalists live equally. This world, you need the traditionalists too, because they preserve.
You need a balance of postmodernism, modernism, and traditionalism, right? And there's a conversation on how to do that.
Correct.
With rationality, science, metaphysics, all of it's relevant to the conversation. Morality, ethics. These things can be discussed very easily. I'm not a full-blown postmodernist, right, which would lead to absurdities. I think that rationality and science, and also tradition in terms of ethics and morality and structure in constructs, you can deconstruct and you can reconstruct, or you can construct, right? You can rebuild a concept. These things are wonderful. I think deconstruction is great. It's a great tool, a skeptical tool, a school that has incredulity toward meta-narrative, skepticism towards meta-narrative. These showing the limitations of language and how even one word can be interpreted in a million different ways. What does that do to a traditionalist Muslim? What does that do to the meaning of the Quran and the Quranic text? You know what I mean? I'm huge into Jungian analysis, right? I don't think that Jungian analysis is the only way to approach scripture. I think that there's mystical and esoteric methods that are other than Jungian analytic as well. And then there's exegetical. But I think that the exegetical hermeneutics are the most limiting, right? Particularly when it comes to Christianity and Islam. Because I think that the church fathers and the Sahaba had limited cognitive and philosophical and theological understanding of what deeper psychological truths were being expressed through Muhammad and Imam Ali and others that may have been enlightened to what degree they were. And what's happening is that the Sahaba, the exegetes could have in their interpretation gotten it wrong. That I would go that far. A mystical hermeneutic, an esoteric hermeneutic, one that spiritualizes and metaphorizes the text, that psychoanalysis has input, metaphor has input. I think that's what's interesting. Those are the types of approaches to scripture that make more sense to me. In Christianity, you have the Gnostics, obviously, but they're 2nd century. You have Meister Eckhart, And then you have even the church fathers in terms of Origin of Alexandria and others, right? Who are universalists, who metaphorize the text, right? Spiritualized, mystical, esoteric interpretation. And so this isn't something new, y'all. It's there in Christianity. It's perennial. It's perennial. Right. And if Muslims want to debate this, they don't want to debate this. I'm telling you, they don't want to debate this. Because if they do, they're going to expose their constituents to a worldview that is far more persuasive than atheism, than Christianity, or whatever they've been debating for the past decade or two, from my perspective.
Wow. Okay.
I've ranted a lot today. I needed to get some things off my chest. I've been quiet for a couple years, bro.
Yeah, man. Well, welcome out of retirement then.
Yeah. Well, let's see what happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Hopefully I've made my intention clear that I have no quarrels with the majority of Muslims. It's only
I think it's
Quran
fair.
thumpers who need to convert you. These people who enable the people who have radical views sometimes. Right. We've seen Muhammad Hijab enable radicals, right? Ones that perhaps invaded Mufti Abulai's home, somebody who's following him in the march against the Hindutva crowd, if you will, and the things that, or not the Hindutva crowd, the Zionist crowd, saying that he's going to do something to a Jew. I think that was in the context of Muhammad Hijab's, and I've studied Muhammad Hijab for a very long time.
Yeah,
very long time. I'm very familiar. The conversation with Faraz Zahabi. Faraz Zahabi was saying things that mystics and people of our ilk would say as Muhammad Hijab sat there in deafening silence, where he should have been calling him out as a heretic if he's coming from an Athari perspective. Listen to that, Faraz Zahabi. You brought up the MMA, the coach for GSP, right? Listen to that conversation and see how similar it is to the perennial philosophy, right?
Right.
But Muhammad Hijab sits there nodding without refuting Faraz Zahabi and his heresies. It's interesting. It's interesting what the possibilities are in terms of articulating the truth in the world of polemics and in the broader conversation.
Right.
So we'll see what happens, bro. I had a little bit of an energy booster before I had a boost of energy for this conversation, bro. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, that's kind of me venting and everything. I don't know if there's anything else to said or you want to get into.
No, I think we're going for almost 3 hours now. Close.
Oh my gosh, that's not good. Hopefully we keep the folks entertained to keep them
I think it's been very entertaining. I've been super entertained. Okay. I'm sure this conversation is going to be very interesting for a lot of people. Whether Hindu, Christian, Muslim, or just skeptics. I think they're really be interesting.
Absolutely.
But
One more thing, we didn't touch on pantheism versus monism and the necessary difference. I like pantheism. I am one with the universe, but that's not the worldview of monism, right? It's not saying that God is in everything, right? That's not the worldview, right? The worldview is that the only existence is Brahman, right?
Yeah. So
that's it.
So yeah, that's going to be the Kevala Advaita position, along with Vishishta Advaita. But Vishishta, there's only one reality.
Yes,
it's Brahman.
That's the fundamental. That's what I'm saying. In the
Brahman is qualified, meaning the entire existence is Brahman. But Brahman is all existence, but existence is not Brahman. Sure. So while Brahman is beyond, he's the ground of being. It's all things, everything.
Sure. To some degree, you acknowledge the surface reality as being as being quote unquote real. You're a realist, versus the Advaita that would say that it's ultimately an illusion.
Right. So Advaita's perspective is anything that doesn't last forever, is not enduring, that changes, is not real, ultimately real. Right. So Vishishta says everything is real.
Yeah. See, that's the thing about me, Mukunda. It's not like, all right, I'm going to take Ramanuja's perspective and forget Shankara, right? Or, oh my gosh, this Neoplatonic model seems so cool. I'm going to be a Neoplatonist now.
Right.
You know, my thing is I've had my psychedelic experience.
I think the Jain epistemology is probably the best.
We'll say it again.
Jain epistemology is probably the best.
Jain. For in terms of the metaphysics, the non-duality?
Their epistemology is hands down the best. Because
they have to knowledge.
Yeah, they have Anekavada, which is no one perspective holds the truth. So all perspectives must be taken and jointly viewed together.
Okay, depending on what we mean by that, I am a person who likes to try to stick by the law of non-contradiction, and stay within that realm. But I do get, like you said, that there's different ways of looking at logic. There's limited approaches that might get the truth on some angles, but then might neglect a certain philosophical, propositional way of framing it.
And there's
right?
Siyadva, that's another one, where they have 7 different ways to view.
But the truth really needs to be experienced, right? That's
So
that's to me
all
that's
the Dharmic traditions, everything requires experience. End of the day, right?
Everything
at some level has some level of phenomenological reality that we have to contend with. So it's not really an orthodoxy situation. It's a ortho experience. I guess.
It's an experience, a mystical experience that can be talked about intersubjectively, and it can be researched in terms of qualitative studies. That's meta-analyses. That's what in terms of talking to somebody who needs science and objective reality, or needs some type of objective way of looking at things. That's the way I put it. And it's a very easy way for them to understand. But
also because that infinite being is infinite, how we experience that infinite being is going to differ.
Yeah. And then it comes down to whether the metaphysical baggage, I like using that word because that's what Abdurrahman used, of the Abrahamic traditions of separating God as a judgmental monarch, right?
So within my framework, one can say, well, that experience is true because God does have a perspective that is like not judgmental the way you're talking about it, but is the one that controls all things and decides all things.
Because there's you can take the principle of karma and compare it to judgment.
Yes.
It's not the same thing conceptually, but I do get what you're saying.
Yes.
Right, I do get what you're.
But my point is
the word judgment seems so. It just seems so petty.
Right, these words.
Right?
So
non-judgment.
It's very interesting because within the Hindu tradition, the world is called name and form. All things are just name and form.
Right.
So,
but Dharma has non-judgment instead of judgment. Then,
so it's the clay that changes from a mound of clay to a pot because the form and name change, but it's still the clay. Right, so it changes yeah.
But the point is that you can use the word judgment. When Muslims anthropomorphize, that's what is anthropomorphism, where the judgment of a deity or a king or a judge, on the weighing of good deeds and bad deeds. It's too simplistic. There's no appreciation for abstraction. Everything has to be black and white and concrete, and that's not a holistic approach to reality.
Yeah, which is where we get to Nati, right? Nati, as we say, Nati.
Which is which again, when you in terms of epistemology.
Yeah.
Right, neti as a negation, and the Neoplatonists love talking about this. The Ismailis love talking about this. Right, neti is a principle of negation to move towards that which is actual, or ultimately real. Right, that is the process in Vedanta even to reach truth of neti of negation of not this, not the body, not the mind, not the senses, not the thought, not the perception, and then you get to consciousness itself. You get to existence itself. You get to divine simplicity, is what I would say. So there's ways to articulate this and talk about it. The question is, are broader Muslims ready? Are y'all ready for this? All right, that's what it comes down to. And then let's see. Anyways, Mukunda, you want to kind of wrap this up?
Yeah. So absolutely, man. So Farhan, thank you for your time, man. This was great. We'll do something like this again sometime soon. I'll reach out to Dawah bros and see if they want to throw us, add you on too. It'll be kind of good. I'll try to release this in the next couple of weeks.
You got to get Javad Hashmi if possible. I'm a fan of his. I would like to see him talk to you if he's willing.
And Khalil Andani.
Of course, Khalil Andani. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Epic individuals.
Yeah.
In terms of they're both academics.
Right.
But great minds. And the amount, because they've done way more reading than I have.
Sure.
And probably both of us combined.
Yeah.
Really amazing people.
Have you? Do you know Shabda Ali?
I've spoken to him before. It's on my YouTube channel. Again, these are, people that I've come across and met and have conversations with. Obviously, I don't know them personally, with the way people know each other personally. That's not the case. But I've spoken to Shabir Ali. He doesn't know how big of a fan I am of his.
Yeah.
And I am. I love the dude.
Well, I mean, if you could link me up with him, that'd be great. I would love to have him on the show too.
Yeah. The reason why I don't know, I like Shabir Ali so much that I wouldn't want him to be seen with me because of how much of a heretic I am. Right. I want him to continue to encourage the Muslims the way that he's encouraging to, especially with the universalism.
Yeah.
That's one of the most important issues.
Well, I want to talk to him on my own then.
Yeah, of course, you and him. I wouldn't talk to him just because I wouldn't want to do that. With Hashmi and Khalil and Dani, I think that they've gone so heretical, right? That my beliefs won't. I mean, well, Ismailis are so heretical to mainstream Islam naturally. Unfortunately, I would say.
Right.
And same thing with Hashmi. He is so heretical in the things that he says, that it makes it easy for us to have a conversation.
Right.
But I still think that he might differ with some of the things. We would differ on many things. I say it's okay to be an atheist. I say it's okay to use symbology as a part of your worship. They would say this is shirk. Still, and that's fine. Nuance, it's not necessary. You don't need the symbol, but it's psychologically potent to get certain people there.
That's right.
Right. Just like kirtan and nasheeds and music is there's different paths for the bhakti and jnana and it's just karma yoga and
as many people as there are different paths, right? This is
it's just Hinduism. That's why I'm absolutely astonished to this day in terms of how comprehensive these traditions are in terms of tackling. Muslims think that they're comprehensive. Wait till you study Hinduism. If you have an earnest, honest, sincere, genuine mind, what you do when you study Hinduism is you see a comprehensive approach like no other, especially when you get into philosophy and mysticism.
Right. Well, great time, Farhan. Let's talk soon. Thank you, everyone, for watching Mirror Media this week. Namaskar, namaste, and we'll see you guys.
Gayati vanamali maduram Gayati vanamali